Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I still get this sick feeling in my stomach whenever I think about what happened that day. My hands are actually shaking a bit as I type this, even though it's been almost 60 years since it happened. October 13th, 1965. That date is burned into my memory. I was just 9 years old back then. My family, Dad, Mom, me, and my little sister Carla, who was 7, were driving our blue Chevy pickup, heading back from my grandparents' place just outside Fort St. John, British Columbia. It was getting dark early those days, and even though it was only about 6:30 in the evening, the sun was already setting. We were on that winding stretch of highway, about 15 miles outside of town. It was the kind of road where the pine trees crowd in close on both sides, making these dark walls of forest. Dad always called it Moose Alley, because you had to keep your eyes peeled for wildlife crossing. My sister and I were in the back seat. I remember I was playing with this little toy soldier, and Carla was humming some song she'd learned at school. The heater in that old truck never worked right. 1 minute you'd be freezing, and the next it would blast hot air like a furnace. Dad had just cranked it down because Mum was complaining about the heat, and he'd rolled his window down just a crack. You could smell the pine trees and that crisp fall air coming in. We were just coming around this bend in the road. I remember because Dad always slowed down there. He was saying something to Mum about stopping for gas in town when he suddenly slammed on the brakes. I jerked forward, almost hitting my head on the front seat. "Jesus Christ," Dad whispered. I'd never heard him use that tone before. It wasn't angry, it was scared. There, standing right in front of our truck, illuminated by our headlights, was something I still struggled to describe without sounding crazy, but I know what I saw. We all saw it. It was massive. Taller than our truck cab for sure, maybe 8 feet tall. It was standing on 2 legs like a person, but it definitely wasn't human. Its body was covered in this dark, brown, black hair, not shaggy like a bear's, but smoother, almost slick-looking. The hair wasn't super long, but it covered everything except its face. The face, God, the face is what haunts me. It wasn't like those fake Bigfoot pictures you see with all the hair covering everything. You could see skin, this leathery, dark, greyish-brown skin. Its face looked almost squashed, like a gorilla but different. The jaw was massive, and its head didn't have a neck exactly, more like the head just sat on top of these massive shoulders. Mom made this little gasping sound next to Dad. Nobody moved. The truck just idled there on the road and time seemed to freeze. The thing just stared at us. Its eyes caught the headlights and reflected back this yellowish-red color, like a cat's eyes, but bigger, way bigger. It blinked once, slowly, like it was sizing us up. Then it moved. I remember how it moved because it wasn't clumsy or lurching like you'd expect something that big to be. It was smooth, deliberate. It took 3 huge steps across the road, each one covering what would take me 6 or 7 steps. Its arms swung at its sides, hanging longer than a person's arm should, with these massive hands that looked like they could wrap around a basketball easily. As it reached the other side of the road, it turned its head and looked back at us for just a second. I swear to this day it looked right at me, even though I was in the back seat. Then it stepped into the trees and was gone. Dad didn't move. The truck just sat there idling for what felt like forever, but was probably only 30 seconds. "John?" Mom whispered, her voice shaking. "What was that?" Dad didn't answer right away. He was gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles were white. Then the smell hit us. Dad had that window cracked, remember? It came through like a wave. This awful, rotten egg smell, like sulfur but worse, mixed with something musky and wild. It was so strong I actually gagged, and Carla started to cry next to me. "Roll up the window," Mom said, covering her nose with her sleeve. Dad fumbled with the crank, his hands shaking so bad he could barely turn it. "That was a Sasquatch," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What the Cree call a weed-a-go, the big hairy man." Dad knew a lot about that stuff. His best friend growing up was from the Cree Nation, and he told Dad stories about these creatures that lived in the deep woods. Dad always respected those stories, even when other people would laugh them off. He wasn't laughing now. "I want to go home!" Carla was sobbing beside me. I put my arm around her, but honestly I was just as scared. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. "We need to pull over," Mom said. "You're shaking too much to drive, John." Dad nodded and carefully eased the truck forward, driving maybe a quarter-mile down the road before pulling onto this little gravel turnout. He shut off the engine, and we just sat there in silence for a few minutes, the only sound being Carla's quiet crying and all of us breathing way too fast. "I need some air," Dad finally said, opening his door. The smell had faded a bit, but you could still catch whiffs of it. "John, don't you dare leave this truck," Mom said, grabbing his arm. "I'm just going to stand right here by the door," he said. I need to think." He stepped out but stayed right next to the truck, leaning against it. I could see him through the window, looking back in the direction we'd come from, then scanning the tree line across from us. His hand kept going to his pocket, where I knew he kept his pocket knife. Not that it would have done anything against what we'd just seen. After a few minutes, he got back in. "We're going to drive to town," he said, his voice steadier now, "and we're going to report this." "Report what?" Mom asked. "Who's going to believe us?" "The thing is," Dad said, starting the truck, "this isn't the first time someone's seen one of these around here. Hank at the gas station was telling me just last month about a logger who saw something similar up near Peace River." We drove the rest of the way to town in silence. I kept looking out the back window, convinced I was going to see that thing following us, but there was nothing but darkness. When we got home, Dad called the RCMP right away. The officer who came over was named Constable Wilson, I remember, because he had this big mustache that moved up and down when he talked. He wrote everything down in his little notebook, but I could tell by the way he was looking at Dad that he didn't believe us. "So you're saying you saw a—" He paused, looking at his notes. "A Sasquatch on Highway 29. "I know how it sounds," Dad said, "but we all saw it, clear as day in our headlights." "And it was how tall again?" the constable asked. "Taller than my truck cab. Had to be 8 feet at least, maybe more." The constable looked at Mom. "Ma'am, you saw this too?" Mom just nodded. She hadn't said much since we got home, just kept making tea. Nobody was drinking. "And the children as well?" He looked at me and Carla, who was curled up next to Mom on the couch. "Ask them yourself," Dad said. The constable turned to me. "Son, what did you see out there?" I tried to explain it just like I'd seen it. The height, the smooth way it moved, those eyes that seemed to look right into me. When I mentioned the smell, the constable actually wrote that down with more interest. "Sulfur smell, you say, like rotten eggs?" I nodded. "That's interesting," he said, more to himself than to us. He wouldn't explain why that was interesting, though. Before he left, he told Dad he'd file a report, but I don't think anything ever came of it, at least not officially. But word got around town pretty quick. A few days later, this man showed up at our door. He introduced himself as Dr. Martin Klein from the University of British Columbia. He said he was documenting Sasquatch sightings across the province. Dr. Klein sat with each of us separately, asking us to describe exactly what we saw without talking to each other first. He seemed particularly interested in how consistent our descriptions were: the height, the smooth movement, the shape of the head, and especially that smell. "The sulfur odor is commonly reported," he told Dad. Nearly 70% of close encounters mention it. The indigenous peoples of this region have described it for generations. Dr. Klein asked if he could take us back to the spot where it happened. Dad was reluctant at first, but eventually agreed. We drove out there the next day. I remember feeling sick to my stomach as we approached that curve in the road. Nothing happened, of course. Dr. Klein took some measurements, made some notes about the landscape and the tree cover, and collected some soil samples from where we thought it had stepped. I don't know what he expected to find. After that day, our lives changed in subtle ways. Dad started carrying his hunting rifle in the truck. Mom would check the locks 2-3 times before bed. I couldn't sleep with my window open anymore, even in the summer heat, because I kept imagining that face appearing on the other side of the glass. School was the worst. Word got around, as it always does in small towns, and the other kids started calling me Bigfoot boy. They'd make these ape noises when I walked past. Only my best friend Travis seemed to take me seriously. His uncle was Cree, and he said his uncle had seen one once too, up near Moberly Lake. About a month after our sighting, a local paper ran a small story about it. They didn't use our names, just called us a local family, but everyone knew it was us. The article mentioned other sightings in the area going back decades. There was one from 1928 that sounded almost exactly like what we saw, right down to the sulfur smell. As the years went by, I tried to convince myself it was just a bear. That's what the skeptics always say, right? You just saw a bear standing on its hind legs. But I know what bears look like. I've seen plenty of them in the woods around Fort St. John. What we saw that night wasn't a bear. It wasn't a man in a suit. It was something else. Dad passed away in 1988, heart attack. On his deathbed, he made me promise to keep an eye out for the weed-a-go. Those were literally among his last words to me. Mom never liked talking about it, and after Dad died, she refused to discuss it altogether. Carla moved to Toronto after high school and never came back. Last time I brought it up with her during a Christmas visit maybe 20 years ago, she said she'd convinced herself it was just a childhood nightmare we all somehow shared. But I know what I saw. I've spent decades reading everything I can find about Sasquatch sightings, talking to witnesses when I can find them, even joining expeditions into the back country. I've never seen another one, but I've found things, strange footprints, broken trees that no bear could snap. And once, on a camping trip near Pink Mountain, I caught that same sulfur smell on the wind just before dawn. I'm 67 years old now. Most people in my life don't know about what happened that day. I learned pretty quick not to bring it up if I wanted to be taken seriously, but I think about it every single day. Those eyes looking into mine, that deliberate way it moved, the absolute certainty that it was intelligent, that it knew exactly what it was doing when it stepped in front of our truck. I still drive that stretch of highway sometimes, always slowing down at that bend. Always watching the tree line, always wondering if it's still out there, watching and waiting. And sometimes, just sometimes when the wind is right, I catch a whiff of something sulphurous on the air, and my heart starts racing just like it did back in 1965. I don't expect anyone to believe me, but I know what I saw. We all did. And no amount of time will ever make me forget that face staring back at me from the edge of the forest. Story 2. I've held this in for so long, but I need to get it off my chest. It's been nearly 60 years, and I still wake up thinking about it sometimes. I'm getting older now, and I want someone to know what happened to me that day in Harrison Mills back in '65. It was late October, and I was 27 at the time. I'd recently taken a job with the Forestry Department in British Columbia after moving up from Washington State. I wasn't working that day. It was a Saturday, and I decided to take a drive out to Harrison Mills to do some hiking. I've always been the outdoorsy type, spent most of my childhood summers camping with my dad, so being alone in the woods never bothered me. The weather was typical for fall in that area, crisp and cool, but not cold enough for more than a light jacket. There was this trail I'd heard about from a co-worker that supposedly had great views of the river. It wasn't well known or heavily trafficked, which was exactly what I wanted. Just some peace and quiet, you know. I parked my old Ford pickup at what passed for a trailhead, basically just a small clearing where the dirt road widened enough to leave a vehicle. I remember taking a thermos of coffee and a sandwich I'd made that morning. Nothing fancy, just some ham and cheese. I had my small backpack with a first aid kit, extra socks, learned that lesson the hard way years before, and a small camera. Wish I'd used that camera for what happened later, but I was too stunned to even think about it. The trail started off pretty wide, maybe 4 feet across, but as I got deeper into the woods, it narrowed until it was barely visible in some spots. The underbrush was thick, lots of ferns and berry bushes. The trees were mostly Douglas fir and cedar, tall enough to block most of the sunlight, creating this green, filtered light that made everything look kind of otherworldly. I'd been walking for maybe an hour and a half when I decided to take a break. Found a fallen log, brushed off some moss and sat down to have my coffee. It was so quiet out there. You know that special kind of forest quiet where you can hear every little sound? A squirrel jumping from branch to branch sounded like footsteps. Birds calling to each other echoed through the trees. That's why I noticed it, I think, because any sound that wasn't natural stood out like a sore thumb. It started with what sounded like branches breaking, but not in the way that happens when a deer or other animal moves through the brush. This was more purposeful, I guess, like someone trying to be quiet but not quite managing it. At first I thought maybe it was another hiker, but this was pretty far off the beaten path. Then I heard what sounded like a soft grunt or maybe a cough. I stood up, called out, "Hello?" No answer, just silence. Even the birds had stopped chirping, which I now know is never a good sign in the woods. I packed up my stuff and continued down the trail, figuring I'd either run into whoever it was or they'd go their own way. But that feeling of being watched just wouldn't go away. You know that prickly sensation on the back of your neck? It was like that, but all over. About 20 minutes later, I heard movement in the underbrush about 30 feet off the trail. Not the wind, this was something solid pushing through the ferns. I stopped walking and just listened. The movement stopped too. That's when I got curious. Maybe it was a bear or a deer, I thought. I should have just kept walking, but I didn't. I stepped off the trail and moved toward the sound, pushing aside ferns and ducking under low-hanging branches. I wasn't being particularly quiet, but I wasn't calling out either, just moving slowly, carefully. The ground was soft with years of fallen pine needles, damp from a rain that had come through the day before. The underbrush got thicker, and I had to use my hands to push aside the branches. My heart was beating faster, though I wasn't sure why at that point. Just the excitement of possibly seeing some wildlife, I told myself. Then I heard it again. Movement, closer now, maybe 15 feet away. I pushed through a particularly thick patch of salal bushes, their leaves slapping against my pants. And there she was. I froze. Everything in me just stopped. My breathing, my thoughts, everything. About 10 feet in front of me was I don't even know what to call it. A being? A creature? Those words don't seem right, but what else can I say? It looked like a small female, about 4'12" feet tall, covered in dark, almost black hair. Not fur like a bear, this was hair, long in some places, especially around the head. The face, God, the face. It was dark with a flat nose and wide nostrils. The eyes were deep set and dark, but so aware. That's what got me the most. The intelligence in those eyes. She was crouched down, like she'd been gathering something from the ground. When she saw me, she slowly stood up, and that's when I noticed what looked like some kind of fur wrapped around her waist. Not her own fur. This was different, lighter in color, brownish red, and clearly wrapped intentionally, like a primitive skirt or covering. We just stared at each other for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds. I wasn't afraid exactly. Shocked, yes. Confused, absolutely. But not afraid. There was something about her that seemed almost cautious, like she was assessing me the same way I was assessing her. I remember thinking, this can't be happening. I'd heard the stories, of course. Everyone who lives in the Pacific Northwest has heard Sasquatch stories, but I'd always written them off as campfire tales or misidentifications of bears or other wildlife. Yet here I was, looking at something I couldn't explain. She made a soft sound then, not quite a grunt, more like a quick exhalation, and she shifted her weight, looking to her right like she was preparing to leave. That small movement broke the spell. I took a step back, not wanting to scare her or provoke her. I had no idea what she was capable of. As I moved, she moved too, backing away into the denser part of the forest. I didn't chase after her. Something told me that would be a very bad idea. Instead, I started backing up slowly, keeping my eyes on the spot where she'd disappeared until I couldn't see it anymore, then turned and made my way back to the trail as quickly as I could without running. When I got back to my truck, I just sat there. My hands were shaking so bad I couldn't even get the key in the ignition right away. I sat there for maybe 30 minutes, trying to process what I'd seen. Was it a bear that my mind had somehow shaped into something more human-like? No. Bears don't wear things around their waists. Was it a person? Maybe a lost child or a woman from one of the local indigenous communities? No. The proportions were all wrong, and no human has that kind of hair covering their body. I finally drove to the nearest town. There was a small diner there, and I went in more to be around normal, everyday things than because I was hungry. I needed to ground myself in reality again. The waitress must have thought I was ill or something because I was so pale and distracted. After 2 cups of coffee and a slice of pie I barely touched, I decided to report what I'd seen. There was a local sheriff's office in town, so I went there. The deputy at the desk looked at me like I was crazy when I started explaining. He was polite enough, but I could tell he thought I was either lying or had seen a bear and let my imagination run wild. He took down my information and said they'd look into it, but his tone made it clear nothing would come of it. As I was leaving, an older man who'd been sitting in the waiting area followed me out. He introduced himself as a local who'd lived in the area his whole life. He told me he believed what I'd seen and that there had been stories about the little forest people in the Harrison Mills area for generations. The local indigenous tribes had names for them and considered them a kind of forest spirit or ancient people who lived deep in the woods. He asked me more details about what I'd seen, particularly about the fur around her waist. When I described it, he nodded, like I'd confirmed something he already knew. He said the old stories mentioned that these beings used simple tools and wore animal skins. He seemed genuinely interested and not at all dismissive, which was somehow both comforting and unsettling. If he believed me so readily, what else had he heard about or seen himself? I drove back to my apartment that night with my mind racing. I didn't tell anyone else for a long time. Not my co-workers, not my friends, not even my family when I called home the next day. Who would believe me? I could barely believe it myself. In the weeks that followed, I went back to that trail 3 times. I never went off the path again, just walked the same route, hoping maybe I'd see something that would explain what I'd encountered. I never did. The forest seemed completely normal, if a bit quieter than I remembered. I did eventually tell my boss at the forestry department, about 2 months later. He was an older guy who'd worked in the BC forests for over 30 years. I expected him to laugh, but he didn't. He just nodded and said, "The woods out here hold more secrets than most people realize." He didn't ask for details, and I didn't offer any. That was the end of it. As the years passed, I read everything I could find about Sasquatch sightings in the Pacific Northwest. Most described much larger creatures, 7 or 8 feet tall, typically male. Very few mentioned smaller ones, and even fewer included details about them wearing anything. I began to wonder if what I'd seen was something else entirely, something not even covered in the Sasquatch literature. Sometimes I think about going back there now, all these years later. The area has probably changed a lot. More development, more people. Would there still be places for something like her to hide? Would she even still be alive? I don't know how long these beings live, if they're real, if what I saw was real. I'm still not sure what to make of my experience. All I know is what I saw that day in Harrison Mills wasn't anything I could explain then, and I still can't explain it now. Those eyes, so intelligent and aware, looking back at me from a face that wasn't human, but wasn't animal either, and that simple fur garment so purposefully placed around her waist. These details have stayed with me, crystal clear, while so many other memories from that time in my life have faded. I've never gone public with this story before now. What would be the point? To be laughed at, or worse, to have people try to hunt down what I saw? No, some things are better left alone, but I'm older now, and I don't want this experience to die with me. So here it is, the full account of what happened to me in the fall of 1965. Make of it what you will. I've made my peace with not knowing exactly what I encountered that day. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, I guess. All I know for certain is that for a brief moment I came face to face with something that shouldn't exist according to everything I'd been taught. And yet, it was there. She was there, as real as the ground beneath my feet. Story 3. I've hesitated sharing this for a long time. Almost 60 years have passed, yet what happened that November day in '65 remains as vivid in my mind as if it happened yesterday. I've been a hunter all my life, spent countless hours in the wilderness of British Columbia, and I know what I saw wasn't a bear, wasn't a moose, wasn't anything I could rationally explain away. I'm writing this now because I'm getting older, and I want this experience documented somewhere before I'm gone. I was 27 back then, hunting near Bella Coola in the Green Bay area. It had been a crisp, clear morning when I set out alone. The mountains were beautiful that time of year, with the leftover frost clinging to the pine needles and that sharp smell of winter approaching. I'd been tracking a buck since dawn, moving through an area that had been logged maybe a year or two before. If you've never been in a recently logged section of BC wilderness, let me tell you, it's some of the most difficult terrain you can imagine. Fallen trees everywhere, stumps, branches, loose rocks and debris piled up in what loggers call slash. Just a mess to get through. By mid-morning, I was frustrated and exhausted. That slash had taken me nearly 2 hours to cross, just a few hundred yards of constant climbing over massive logs, squeezing under fallen trees, and navigating what amounted to a giant woodland obstacle course. My pants were torn at the knee, and I had scratches all over my hands. I'd lost the buck's trail somewhere in that mess and decided to climb to higher ground to get my bearings. That's when I saw it. About 200 yards away, across another section of slash, I noticed what at first looked like a dark figure moving along the edge of the tree line. My initial thought was, it might be another hunter, though I hadn't seen any other vehicles at the access road. I pulled out my binoculars to get a better look. What I saw through those lenses made my blood run cold. It wasn't a man. It was man-like, yes, but much larger, covered in what appeared to be dark, almost black hair or fur. The creature was tall. I'd estimate around 7 to 8 feet in height. What really caught my attention was a distinctive white patch on its chest, almost like a blaze running from its neck downward. I remained frozen, binoculars pressed to my eyes, hardly daring to breathe. The thing hadn't spotted me yet. I was downwind and partially concealed by a stand of younger pines, so I just watched. What happened next is what convinced me this was no man in a suit, no bear, nothing explainable. The creature approached the slash, the same kind of logging debris that had taken me 2 back-breaking hours to cross earlier. But instead of struggling like I had, this thing moved through it with an ease that was almost graceful. Where I had to crawl under logs, this creature simply stepped over them. Where I had to climb and scramble over obstacles, it cleared them in single strides. Its strength was incredible. At one point, I watched it casually push aside a fallen tree trunk that would have taken 3 or 4 men to move. I couldn't tear my eyes away. The way it moved was both terrifying and fascinating. It walked upright the entire time, completely bipedal, but with a strange rolling gait that was definitely not human. Its arms were long, hanging well past its waist, and it occasionally used them to balance as it navigated the terrain. That section of slash that had taken me 2 hours to cross? This thing traversed it in about 10 minutes. 10 minutes! I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The efficiency and power of its movement was unlike anything I'd ever witnessed in the wilderness, and I've seen bears, moose, elk, all the large mammals of the Pacific Northwest. As it reached the far tree line, the creature paused. It turned slightly, and for a moment I thought it might be looking in my direction. My heart nearly stopped. I lowered the binoculars instinctively, not wanting to see its face if it had spotted me. When I raised them again a few seconds later, the creature was gone, disappeared into the dense forest beyond the logged area. I stayed put for a long time after that, maybe 30 minutes, just listening and watching. The woods had gone eerily quiet. No birds, no squirrels chattering, just silence. Eventually, my curiosity overcame my fear. I needed to see if there was any evidence, anything to confirm what I'd witnessed. I carefully made my way across the clearing and into the slash area where I'd seen the creature. The going was tough, just as it had been earlier. I kept stopping to listen, constantly looking around, my rifle ready. I've never felt so alert, yet so vulnerable in the woods before. Every snapping twig made me jump. When I reached the spot where I believed the creature had entered the forest, I found some disturbed ground and broken branches. The forest floor was mostly rocks and hard-packed earth there, not ideal for tracks, but I did find what looked like partial footprints in a few small patches of softer soil. They were large, much larger than my own boot prints, and appeared to show a broad foot with 5 toes, not unlike a human footprint, but scaled up significantly. More telling were the broken branches. Some were snapped off at a height of nearly 8 feet, consistent with what I estimated the creature's height to be. These weren't breaks from wind or snow load. They were clean snaps like something had pushed through them. The smell was what really got to me, though. In that area where the creature had passed through, there was a distinct odor, musky, wild, almost like wet dog, but stronger and more pungent. I've been around plenty of wildlife, and this smell wasn't like anything I recognized. I didn't venture further into the forest. Something in my gut told me that would be pushing my luck. Instead, I backed away, keeping my eyes on the tree line, and made my way back to my truck as quickly as I could. The entire way out, I felt watched. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and every instinct I had was screaming at me to run. When I finally reached my truck, I sat there for a while, hands shaking so badly I couldn't get the key in the ignition right away. I wasn't just scared, I was experiencing something deeper, more primal, like my entire understanding of the natural world had been shaken. That night at the small motel in Bella Coola, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying what I'd seen, trying to rationalize it. Could it have been a bear? No, bears don't walk upright for extended periods like that. They might stand on their hind legs briefly, but they don't traverse difficult terrain bipedally. And the white patch on the chest, black bears sometimes have a white blaze. But this was different, more defined. Plus, the movement was all wrong for a bear. A man in a suit? Out there, miles from anywhere, moving through like it was a sidewalk? No chance. The strength and agility I witnessed would be impossible to fake, especially in such challenging terrain. The next morning, I reported what I'd seen to a local conservation officer. He didn't laugh at me, which I appreciated, but I could tell he was skeptical. He took notes, asked if I'd been drinking, I hadn't, and basically filed it away as another unverified sighting. I later learned there had been other reports from that area over the years. Not many, but enough to suggest I wasn't the only one who'd experienced something unexplainable in those mountains. In the decades since, I've returned to hunting many times, but never alone, and never in that specific area again. I've told this story to only a handful of people: my wife, who believes me, a couple of close hunting buddies who don't know what to believe, and now, here. What haunts me most isn't just the creature itself, but the effortless way it moved through that impossible terrain. We humans, with all our technology and equipment, are still bound by our physical limitations. But what I saw that day moved through the wilderness like it owned it, like the forest was its home, and it knew every inch. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. I know how it sounds. If someone told me this story before it happened to me, I'd probably think they were exaggerating or confused or just making things up. But I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a man. It was something else entirely. Something that most people believe is just a legend, a campfire story. I've spent countless hours researching Sasquatch sightings since then. Many reports describe similar features: the height, the dark hair, sometimes even the white chest marking. What's most convincing to me is when people describe that same incredible mobility. You don't think about that aspect until you've seen it yourself. How something so large can move with such efficiency through terrain that would challenge or exhaust any human. To this day, when I'm in the woods and the birds suddenly go silent, I find myself looking over my shoulder, scanning the tree line. I've never seen anything like it again, but sometimes, especially in remote areas of those coastal mountains, I get that feeling of being watched. And I remember what happened that November day in 1965. I don't have proof. I don't have photos or plaster casts of footprints. All I have is what I saw with my own eyes and the absolute certainty that for a brief time on a cold November morning, I shared the wilderness with something that science says doesn't exist. Call it Sasquatch, Bigfoot, or whatever name you want. It was real, it was there, and not a day goes by that I don't think about it. Story 4. I've carried this story inside me for nearly 60 years now, and it's time I got it off my chest. I was just a kid back in '65, around 12 years old, and what happened that summer day changed me forever. My family moved away from North Vancouver not long after, and I've never set foot in those woods again, not once. It was mid-July 1965, one of those perfect Pacific Northwest summer days. Me, Tommy and Davy were out doing what we always did, hunting for frogs at Mackey Pond. It wasn't really called that on any map, but Tommy's older brother had named it after finding some old Mackey whiskey bottles there, so that's what we called it. The pond was about a half-mile into the woods behind our neighborhood, in that area where North Vancouver starts giving way to the thicker forests. We had our frog bags and nets, wearing cut-off jeans and t-shirts, sneakers all muddy from previous expeditions. Nothing unusual about that day at first. We'd started early, maybe around 10 in the morning, wanting to beat the real heat of the afternoon. The pond was a good size, maybe 50 yards across, kind of kidney-shaped, with tall reeds on one side and more open access on our side. The woods around it were typical coastal forest, lots of fir trees, some cedar, undergrowth thick enough that you had to stick to the trails. We had a favorite spot where the frogs seemed to gather, and we'd already caught 4 or 5 of the bigger ones. We never kept them long, just admired them, maybe raced them, then let them go. but catching them was the real fun. We were all crouched at the water's edge, talking about whether we should head to the deeper end of the pond, where the really big bullfrogs sometimes hung out. That's when Davy went quiet, mid-sentence. I'll never forget the look on his face. His eyes got wide, his mouth just froze open. At first I thought he was joking around, but then I realized he was looking at something across the pond. I turned to look, and my heart just about stopped. Standing there, maybe 40, 50 yards away on the other side of the pond was, well, I didn't have a word for it then. Now I know it was what people call a Sasquatch or Bigfoot, but back then, all I knew was that I was looking at something impossible. It was huge, not like a bear standing up. I'd seen that before when hiking with my dad. This was different. It stood fully upright like a person, but massive. I'd guess it was at least 7 feet tall, maybe closer to 8. And it was covered in hair. Not fur exactly, but long hair, kind of a reddish-brown color. The hair wasn't super thick like on a bear. I could see the shape of its body underneath. None of us made a sound. We just froze. It hadn't seemed to notice us yet. It was looking at something in the trees to its right. That's when I realized something that made this whole thing even weirder. It looked female. I can't explain exactly how I knew, but there was something about the shape of its body that wasn't male. It had a chest that looked different, and its waist was more defined. I know that sounds crazy, but it's what I saw. Tommy whispered something so quiet, I barely heard him. What the hell is that? And that's when it turned toward us. Its face is burned into my memory, not quite human, not quite ape. The brow was heavy, but the eyes were aware. That's what got me the most. They weren't animal eyes. There was something in there looking back at us that understood what it was seeing. For maybe 5 seconds, we all just stared at each other across that pond. Then it did something I'll never forget. It turned slightly to its left, reached out with both arms, and grabbed hold of a young tree, probably a 4-inch thick cedar. Without any apparent effort, it snapped that tree like it was breaking a pencil. The sound echoed across the pond, a sharp crack that made my whole body flinch. It didn't pull the tree down or push it over, it just broke it clean off at about shoulder height, which would have been maybe 6-7 feet up from the ground. I've worked construction my whole adult life, and I know what it takes to break wood like that. A grown man with an axe would need several good swings to get through a tree that size. This thing just snapped it like kindling. After breaking the tree, it looked back at us. I swear to God, it was showing us what it could do, like a warning. That's when the spell broke and pure panic set in. I don't remember deciding to run. I just remember suddenly being in motion, scrambling backward, dropping my frog bag. Tommy was already a few steps ahead of me, and Davy was right beside me. None of us screamed. We were too terrified for that. We just ran. I remember the feeling of absolute certainty that it was coming after us. Every snap of a twig behind me, every rustle of leaves felt like it was right on our heels. We ran the whole way back to our neighborhood without once looking back. We didn't even stick to the trail. We just crashed through the underbrush in the most direct route home. I was the first one to make it back to the street. My house was closest, so we all ran there. My mom was in the kitchen when we burst through the back door, all of us gasping for breath, covered in scratches from branches, soaking wet from sweat and pond water. She took one look at us and dropped the dish she was washing. She said later that we looked like we'd seen a ghost, all 3 of us white as sheets, shaking, unable to get words out properly. When we finally calmed down enough to tell her what we saw, she didn't laugh or tell us we were making it up. That's one thing I've always been grateful for. She sat us down, gave us Kool-Aid, and listened. We all told the same story, the massive creature, the way it looked at us, how it snapped that tree. My mom called Tommy's and Davy's parents, and they came over. Then she did something that would make our local encounter much more widely known. She called CKNW, the big Vancouver radio station. I remember being embarrassed when she did that, worried people would think we were crazy or attention-seeking, but she believed us, and she thought people should know. Later that afternoon, Tommy's dad took us back to the pond, along with my dad and Davy's older brother. I didn't want to go, but the adults insisted. They said we needed to face our fears, that it was probably just a bear we had misidentified. I remember clinging to my dad's hand the whole way there, something I hadn't done in years. When we got to the pond, everything was quiet, no sign of the creature, but the broken tree was exactly where we said it would be. I'll never forget the look on my dad's face when he examined that break. He was a logger, worked in the industry his whole life. He ran his hand over the break, looked at the tree's diameter, and then looked back at us with an expression I'd never seen before. "No human broke this," was all he said. The adults measured the height of the break, right about 6'8", off the ground. The break was clean with just some splintering, exactly like we'd described. Not cut with a saw or an axe, not pushed over gradually, broken with force all at once. A couple days later, some guys from UBC, University of British Columbia, came out to look at the site. They took pictures, measurements, even made plaster casts of some depressions in the mud that might have been footprints, though they weren't very clear. They interviewed us separately, and all our stories matched. They seemed particularly interested in our observation that the creature appeared female, asking us several times how we knew and what features made us think that. For weeks afterward, I couldn't sleep. Every night, I'd lie awake, thinking I heard heavy footsteps outside my window. I started having nightmares about being chased through the woods, about that creature catching me and snapping my bones like that tree. Sometimes I'd dream that it had followed us home, that it knew where we lived. My parents moved us to Victoria the following year. They said it was for my dad's job, but I always suspected it had something to do with that day. Tommy's family moved to California that same year. Over time, I tried to rationalize what we saw. Maybe it was a bear, despite the way it stood and moved. Maybe it was a man in some kind of costume, though I can't imagine any human with the strength to snap that tree. Maybe we were all caught in some kind of mass hysteria, seeing something that wasn't there, except that doesn't explain the broken tree. I'm 69 years old now, and I've never told this story publicly before. For most of my life, I didn't talk about it at all. When Sasquatch became more of a cultural phenomenon in the 70s, I kept quiet. I didn't want to be associated with the kooks and attention seekers. I didn't want to be mocked, but I know what I saw that day. All three of us saw it. I've never been back to North Vancouver's forests. When my job sent me there for a project in '82, I stayed in my hotel room after work, declining invitations to hike or explore. Even now, nearly 60 years later, the thought of those woods makes my heart race. Sometimes I wonder if that creature is still out there, or others like it. The forests around North Vancouver are different now, more development, more people. But there are still vast stretches of wilderness, places people rarely go. The thing that sticks with me most isn't the size of the creature, or even its incredible strength. It's the intelligence in those eyes, the deliberateness of its actions. It wasn't just showing off when it broke that tree. It was communicating, telling us exactly what it could do to us if it wanted. And for some reason it didn't want to. It let us go. I've wondered about that my whole life, why it just watched us run away. Was it as surprised to see us as we were to see it? Was it protecting something nearby? Was breaking that tree its way of establishing a boundary? I don't have answers. I just have the memory, as vivid today as it was in 1965. The sound of that tree breaking, the way the creature's eyes locked with mine across the pond, the absolute certainty in that moment that I was looking at something that wasn't supposed to exist. I've read other accounts of Sasquatch sightings over the years, and many describe similar details: the height, the reddish-brown hair, the human-like posture. but I've found very few that mention a female Sasquatch. I've often wondered if what we saw that day was particularly rare. As for Davy and Tommy, we lost touch over the years. Last I heard, Tommy became a biologist, which seems fitting somehow. I don't know if they still think about that day as much as I do, if they still wake up sometimes from dreams of being watched by something intelligent and ancient in those North Vancouver woods. All I know is that whenever I see a documentary about Bigfoot or read an article debunking Sasquatch sightings, I think about that tree breaking. I think about those eyes. And I know that whatever science has to say on the matter, something was in those woods with us that day. Something that shouldn't have been possible, but was. Story 5. I've been a hunting guide for over 30 years, working these BC mountains since I was just a kid following my old man around. I know every ridge, valley and creek from Hope to Williams Lake. I know what a bear looks like at 500 yards in poor light. I know the difference between a moose and an elk silhouette at dusk. And I damn well know when I'm looking at something that shouldn't exist. This happened back in '63, early October. I had 2 clients up from Seattle, Richard Westmore and his brother-in-law Tom Peterson. Good men, experienced hunters who'd been coming up to the Bridge River area with me for several seasons. They weren't the type to get spooked by shadows or mistake a stump for a cougar. Richard was some kind of engineer, methodical and skeptical about everything. Tom worked in insurance, equally no nonsense. We'd set up our main camp near Goldbridge, but that morning we'd packed light and hiked up toward the headwaters of Relay Creek. Beautiful country up there, pristine, barely touched. The air was crisp, maybe 40 degrees, with that perfect fall clarity that makes distances deceiving. We'd spotted a nice bull moose the previous evening, moving up the valley, so we were following its trail. By mid-morning, we'd climbed to about 7,000 feet elevation. I remember checking my altimeter watch, a gift from my wife the Christmas before. We set up in a small clearing that gave us a good vantage point across a steep ravine to the opposite ridge, maybe 200 to 250 yards away. The plan was simple: glass the opposite slope for a few hours, have lunch, then either move up or down, depending on what we spotted. We had our rifles set up on shooting sticks. Richard and Tom both carried Remington 700s in 30-06 with Redfield 3-dealer 9X scopes. Good setups for this kind of country where shots could range from 100 to 400 yards. I was using my loopholed binoculars, scanning methodically from left to right across the slope. It was around 11:30. I remember checking my watch because I was thinking about suggesting we break for an early lunch if we didn't see anything soon. That's when Richard whispered, "Chilco, what the hell is that over there?" At first I thought he'd spotted our moose. I whispered back, "Where?" 10 o'clock, just above that fallen spruce. Something's moving in the brush. I shifted my binoculars to where he was pointing. The fallen spruce was easy to spot. A big old tree that had come down recently enough that it still had brown needles. Just above it was a thicket of younger trees and some berry bushes. I didn't see anything at first. Then something moved. My first thought was bear. We'd seen plenty of grizzly sign that morning, but immediately I knew this wasn't a bear. The movement wasn't right. "I see it too," Tom whispered. He was looking through his scope. Through my binoculars, I could make out something dark moving behind the brush. Then it stood up. I've spent my entire life in these mountains. I've seen everything that lives here, every creature in every kind of light, in every season. What rose up from behind those bushes wasn't anything I recognized. The head and shoulders emerged first. Even at that distance I could tell it was big, much bigger than a man. The head was shaped wrong for a bear, not rounded with small ears on top, but more conical, more human. But it was covered completely in hair, dark brown or maybe reddish brown in the sunlight. The hair on its face was longer, hanging down like some kind of beard. Richard whispered, "Is that a person?" Some kind of hermit. I shook my head. No human being is built like that. The three of us just froze, watching this thing through our optics. I couldn't take my eyes off it. The creature was partially hidden by vegetation, but I could see its head turning slowly, as if scanning the valley. It seemed to be looking for something. I got the distinct impression it was hunting just like we were. "Tom, what do you see through your scope?" I asked quietly. "I can see its eyes," he said, his voice tight with tension. "They're dark, set deep under a heavy brow. The face is flat, not a snout. It's not a bear, Chilko." I knew he was right. I've been up close to more black bears and grizzlies than I can count. This wasn't a bear. The proportions were all wrong. The shoulders were too square, too straight. A bear's shoulders hunch up around its neck. This thing had a neck with the head sitting on top like a person's. Richard said, "Should I put one in the air? Scare it off?" "No," I said immediately. Something told me that was a very bad idea. Just keep watching. For what felt like forever, but was probably 3 to 4 minutes, we observed this creature. It never fully emerged from the brush, just the head and upper torso visible above the vegetation. I estimated it stood at least 7 feet tall, maybe more. The breadth of its shoulders was enormous, half again as wide as a big man's. Then it did something that still gives me chills. It sniffed the air, raising its head slightly and turning directly toward our position. There's no way it could have heard us at that distance. We were barely whispering, and there was a light breeze blowing across the valley toward us. But somehow it sensed something. For a brief moment I felt like it was looking right at me, not just in our direction, at me specifically. I can't explain why I felt that, but I did. It was a feeling of being seen, recognized, assessed. Then, with deliberate, smooth movements, it backed away into the trees. No panic, no rush. It simply melted back into the forest. "Should we go after it?" Tom asked. I remember laughing, a nervous sound that surprised even me. "With what? We've got hunting rifles, not elephant guns." The truth was, I had no desire to follow that thing, none whatsoever. Every instinct I had as a woodsman was screaming to stay put. We waited another 30 minutes, but it didn't reappear. Finally, we packed up and moved to another vantage point about half a mile away. We didn't talk much the rest of the day. We half-heartedly continued our moose hunt, but our hearts weren't in it anymore. That night back at the main camp, over whiskey, we finally discussed what we'd seen. "Could it have been someone in a suit?" Richard asked. But even he didn't sound convinced. I'd been thinking about it all day. Nobody's hiking around in a suit at 7,000 feet in these mountains. There's no roads within 20 miles of where we were, no logical reason for anyone to be there, let alone in some kind of costume. "What about a bear standing on its hind legs?" Tom suggested. "You saw it through your scope, Tom. Did that look like a bear's face to you?" He took a long pull of whiskey. No, it didn't." "And bears don't stand that still that long," I added. "They go up on their hind legs to look or smell, then come back down. This thing was upright the entire time we watched it." "So, what are you saying, Chilko?" Richard asked. "You think we saw some kind of, Sasquatch?" I'd been guiding in those mountains for decades. I'd heard the stories, of course. Every guide has, miners, loggers, hunters. They all had tales about something big living in the deep woods. I'd always written them off as campfire talk. "I don't know what we saw," I said honestly, "but it wasn't a bear, and it wasn't a man." The three of us made a pact that night. We'd report what we saw to the Forestry Service, but we wouldn't go public with it. Richard and Tom had professional reputations to maintain. So did I. Nobody wants to hire a guide who spins yarns about monsters in the woods. The next day, we continued our hunt in a completely different drainage. Nobody suggested going back to Relay Creek. We never did get that moose, but nobody seemed to care anymore. When we got back to town, I filed a report with the local wildlife officer, Jim Blackburn. I'd known Jim for years. He trusted my judgment on wildlife matters. He wrote everything down without comment, but I could tell he was skeptical. He didn't say I was lying, but he hinted that maybe the light had been playing tricks on us, or perhaps we'd seen some unusual bear behavior. But I know what I saw. So did Richard and Tom. That winter, I researched everything I could about similar sightings in the region. There were more than I expected, reports from loggers, surveyors, hunters. Most were brief glimpses, but a few described extended observations like ours. The details matched. The height, the massive shoulders, the hair-covered body with a more human-like head. I've gone back to that same area dozens of times over the years. Never saw anything like it again. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the high country, I get a prickly feeling on the back of my neck, a sense that I'm being watched. I've learned to pay attention to that feeling. Richard passed away back in '89. Tom and I still talk occasionally. He's in a nursing home now in Tacoma. His mind is still sharp, though, and he remembers that day as clearly as I do. I'm getting old myself now. I don't guide anymore. My knees can't handle the mountains these days, but I still think about what we saw that day. I've kept the exact location to myself all these years. Somehow, it felt wrong to tell people, like I'd be betraying a secret I was privileged to glimpse. I know there are people who make a hobby out of searching for these creatures. They've got their cameras and casts of footprints and all kinds of theories, but I wonder if they understand what they're really looking for. This wasn't some dumb animal. What I saw that day was intelligent. It knew we were there. It decided to leave. Sometimes I think about what might have happened if we'd followed it, or if Richard had fired that warning shot. I'm glad we didn't. Some things in this world deserve their privacy, deserve to remain mysteries. I've told this story exactly 3 times in my life. Once to the wildlife officer, once to my wife on her deathbed. She always knew I was keeping something from her about that trip. And now here. I don't expect anyone to believe me. That's fine. I know what I saw. There are more things in these mountains than are listed in the wildlife books. I've spent my life in the wilderness and I'm still learning its secrets. But that one day in '63, that was the day I realized how little I really knew, how little any of us know. The memory is still so vivid. That moment when it looked toward us, toward me. There was awareness there, recognition. 2 intelligent species acknowledging each other across an impossible divide. I've never been able to explain it. I don't think I ever will. Story 6. I've never shared this with anybody. Not my wife, not my friends, not even my hunting buddies. But I need to get this off my chest finally. It's been almost 60 years, and I still think about what I saw that day in the Spiller Machine area. I was 27 years old then, back in May of '66. I'd been hunting those woods since I was a kid with my dad. I knew every ridge, every valley, every creek. I could tell you where the deer bedded down and where the elk crossed, but nothing prepared me for what I saw that day. It was a crisp morning, probably around 40 degrees. We'd had a late snow the night before, about 4 inches, which wasn't that unusual for May in that part of the country. The fresh powder was good for tracking, and I was hoping to get a black bear. I'd been out since dawn, moving slow and quiet through the trees. My old Winchester .30-06 felt comfortable in my hands. I'd taken more game with that rifle than I could count. Around mid-morning, I was working my way up a ridge when I spotted movement in a small clearing about 35 to 40 feet ahead. At first, I thought I'd lucked out and found a couple of bears. From where I was standing, partially hidden behind some pine trees, I could make out what looked like dark shapes moving around in the snow. I immediately slowed my breathing and tried to get a better look. Something felt off right away. These weren't moving like any bears I'd ever seen. Bears kind of lumber around on all fours, but these things were upright. I remember thinking maybe they were standing bears. You know how they sometimes rear up to get a better look at something? But they stayed upright, and they were sort of scuffling with each other in the snow. My heart started beating faster. I wasn't scared at that point, just confused. I knew I needed a better vantage point, so I carefully worked my way to an embankment nearby where I could crouch behind a fallen log. I was now about 150 feet away, with a clear line of sight. What I saw next made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. These weren't bears. They were too tall, too thin. Their proportions were all wrong. They had these long arms that hung down almost to their knees, and they were covered in dark reddish-brown hair, not fur like a bear, but more like a shaggy coat all over their bodies. I estimated they stood at least 7 feet tall, maybe 8 for the biggest one. I remember the sensation of my mouth going completely dry. My fingers were tingling. I knew what I was looking at, but my brain wouldn't accept it. We'd all heard the stories around campfires. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever you want to call them. I never believed those stories, thought they were just tall tales people told to spook each other. But there they were, plain as day, 3 massive creatures moving around in the snow, not even a football field away from me. They didn't seem to know I was there. They kept moving farther from my position, ending up about 300 feet away. I stayed frozen behind that log, afraid to move a muscle. I remember thinking I should just back away slowly and get the hell out of there, but curiosity kept me rooted to the spot. How many people had ever seen something like this? I couldn't look away. That's when things got even stranger. 2 of them seemed to be interacting in a way I'd never expected. One of them laid down on its back in the snow. The other one, slightly smaller but still massive, got on top, face to face. I'm not going to get too graphic here, but it was obvious they were mating, but not like animals usually do. This was face to face, almost human-like. The third one stood a few yards away, just watching them. I remember feeling like I was witnessing something I absolutely shouldn't be seeing, like I'd stumbled onto something private and sacred that no human was meant to see. My hands were shaking so bad I had to press the rifle against the log to steady it. I kept blinking, thinking maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. But every time I opened them, those creatures were still there, doing what they were doing. I don't know what came over me then. Maybe it was fear or disbelief, or just the hunter's instinct. I raised my rifle and aimed at the one standing. Looking back, I don't know what I was thinking. What the hell was I going to do with a dead Sasquatch if I actually hit it? But in that moment, I just reacted. I took the shot. I missed. The bullet kicked up snow a few feet to the left of the standing creature. The sound of the rifle echoed through the trees like a crack of thunder. Everything happened so fast after that. All 3 of them jerked their heads in my direction. The 2 on the ground scrambled to their feet with shocking speed. Then they ran, not on all 4s like a bear would, but upright on 2 legs. Their strides were enormous, covering ground faster than any human could. They disappeared into the thick forest within seconds. The silence that followed was deafening. I sat there behind that log, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. My hands were shaking, and I felt sweat running down my back despite the cold. I must have stayed there for at least 30 minutes, just trying to process what I'd seen and waiting to make sure they were really gone. When I finally worked up the courage to move, I carefully made my way to where they had been. The snow was all disturbed, with clear impressions where they'd been. And there they were, footprints, but not bear prints, not human prints. These were huge, easily 16, 17 inches long, with 5 toes clearly visible in the soft snow. The stride length between prints was incredible, at least 4 to 5 feet apart. No human could make a stride like that. I knelt down in the snow and placed my hand next to one of the prints. My hand looked like a child's in comparison. I remember touching the edge of one print, feeling the compacted snow, confirming to myself that this was real, that I wasn't imagining things. I followed the tracks for about 100 yards until they disappeared into rocky terrain where the snow was patchy. Part of me wanted to keep going, to find them again, to prove to myself I wasn't crazy. But a stronger part the part that had kept me alive through decades of hunting in dangerous backcountry, told me to leave it alone, to get back to my truck and drive home and never speak of this to anyone. The walk back to my truck took about an hour. Every snap of a twig made me jump. Every shadow looked like a tall, hairy figure. I kept my rifle ready the whole time, though I knew it would probably be useless if those things decided to come after me. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my gear in the back and sat in the driver's seat for a long time, just staring out the windshield. My hands were still shaking so bad I couldn't get the key in the ignition at first. I remember looking at my watch. It was just past noon. The whole encounter had lasted maybe 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. I drove home in a daze. My wife asked me why I was back so early, and I mumbled something about not feeling well. I put the rifle away, took a hot shower, and tried to make sense of what I'd seen. Should I tell someone? Would anyone believe me? What would happen to those creatures if people knew they were real? I decided to keep quiet. I told myself I'd think about it for a few days, figure out who to tell. But days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and eventually I just locked it away in my mind. Sometimes I'd be out hunting and I'd see a shadow move between trees, and my heart would skip a beat. But I never saw them again. I've spent decades wondering about what I saw that day. It wasn't just that they existed. That was shocking enough. It was how they behaved. That mating ritual, if that's what it was, seemed so deliberate, so intimate. And the way the third one watched, like it was standing guard, or maybe it was some kind of social thing I couldn't understand. These weren't mindless animals. There was something else going on there, something complex, something almost human. I'm an old man now. Most of my hunting buddies are gone. The woods I knew so well have changed. More roads, more houses pushing into what used to be wilderness. I wonder sometimes if those creatures are still out there, or if they've been pushed out like everything else. I've read articles over the years about Bigfoot sightings, seen the blurry photos and shaky videos. I always notice how they describe them as solitary creatures. But that's not what I saw. I saw social behavior. I saw what looked like affection. I saw something that makes me think these beings, whatever they are, have families and relationships and maybe even societies we know nothing about. I've never gone looking for them again. Part of me feels guilty about taking that shot. I didn't mean to scare them, didn't mean to invade whatever it was they were doing. I just reacted out of shock and disbelief. I hoped they just moved deeper into the wilderness and kept on living their lives, away from people like me who wouldn't understand what they were seeing. So that's it. That's what I saw on a snowy morning in May 1966. I've never told a soul until now. Maybe nobody will believe this anyway. Hell, sometimes I wake up and wonder if I dreamed the whole thing. But then I remember the size of those footprints in the snow, the way they ran upright through the trees, the sheer impossible reality of them, and I know it was real. I don't have any photos or plaster casts or physical evidence, just the memory of what I saw burned into my brain forever. And now that I'm in my 80s, I figured I should share it before it's too late. Make of it what you will. I know what I saw. Story 7. I never thought I'd be sharing this, but it's been almost 57 years and I still can't make sense of what happened that day. I'm not someone who believes in monsters or goes looking for trouble. I'm just a farmer. Was a farmer, I should say. I've worked the land all my life in Richmond. Honest work, nothing fancy. July 9th, 1966. That date is burned into my memory. I was 34 then, had my farm for about a decade. It was a Saturday, hot as blazes, and I was working on fixing the fence line in the boggy section of my property. You know the kind, soft ground, those scrubby little trees that never amount to much. I had my posts, wire cutters, and was just trying to get the damn thing finished before the afternoon heat really kicked in. I'd been at it since about 6 that morning. My wife had packed me a sandwich and a thermos of coffee. and I'd been making decent progress. The ground was soft enough to make digging the post holes easier than usual, but that also meant the fence needed more support to stay put when the cattle leaned against it. It must have been around 10:30 or so when I heard it. My cattle, I had about 20 head at the time, suddenly started making a racket in the north pasture, not just your normal mooing or snorting, but that panicked sound they make when they're spooked bad. Anyone who's raised cattle knows exactly what I'm talking about. It's different. It gets your attention fast. I dropped my shovel and started heading that way. The north pasture was up a slight rise from where I was working, maybe 400 yards away. I could see dust rising before I could see the cattle. When I got to where I could see over the rise, I saw my entire herd running full tilt along the fence line, bunched together like they do when they're terrified. At first, I thought maybe a coyote or a neighbor's dog had gotten in there. That happens sometimes. But then I saw... Hell, I still don't know what I saw. There was something chasing them, something big. It was running on 2 legs, not 4. Even from that distance, I could tell it was massive, taller than any man I'd ever seen, and covered in hair, dark, matted hair all over its body. It wasn't a bear standing up. I've seen plenty of bears in my day. Bears don't run like that. This thing was taking these long strides, arms swinging, chasing my cattle like it was nothing. I just froze. Couldn't even yell. Just stood there watching this creature run after my herd. It was keeping pace with them easily, which is saying something when cattle are in a full panic. The thing must have been going 25 to 30 miles an hour at least. The strangest part was how it moved. There was something almost human about it, but not quite. The proportions were all wrong. Too tall, arms too long, but it wasn't lumbering or awkward. It moved with purpose, like it knew exactly what it was doing. This went on for maybe 30 seconds before the cattle made a sharp turn away from it, and the thing slowed down and then stopped. It just stood there for a moment, and I swear I can't be sure at that distance, but I think it turned and looked right at me. My blood went cold. I didn't move a muscle. Then it turned and loped off into the trees at the edge of the pasture. Just disappeared. The whole thing probably lasted less than a minute, but it felt like forever. I just stood there for I don't know how long. My heart was hammering so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I kept thinking it would come back out of the trees, but it didn't. Finally, I snapped out of it and went to check on my cattle. They were still agitated, huddled together at the far end of the pasture. I counted them, all there, none injured that I could see, just scared out of their wits. Can't say I blamed them. I didn't have a gun with me, wasn't in the habit of carrying one while doing fence work. So I headed back to the house, keeping my eyes on those trees the whole time. I kept trying to come up with a rational explanation for what I'd seen. A bear? No, definitely not. A man in a costume, out here miles from town, chasing my cattle? No sense in that either. When I got to the house, my wife could tell something was wrong right away. I told her what I'd seen, and she looked at me like I'd lost my mind. I don't blame her. I would have thought the same thing. She asked if I'd been out in the sun too long. Maybe I had. But I knew what I saw. After cooling off with some water and settling my nerves a bit, I decided to go back out. Partly because I needed to finish the fence work, but mostly because I needed to make sure that whatever it was wasn't still on my property. I grabbed my rifle this time. I checked on the cattle again first. They had calmed down some, but were still bunched up tighter than usual. I walked the perimeter of that pasture, looking for breaks in the fence or any sign of what I'd seen. Didn't find anything obvious, though the ground was torn up pretty good where the cattle had been running. Then I remembered I had another section of fence to check about half a mile from the house, on the opposite side from where I'd seen the creature. This was a corner post I'd put in just last fall, a solid piece of work. I dug the hole 2 feet deep, set the post, packed it tight, and wired it securely to the adjoining sections. When I got there, my stomach dropped. The corner post, a good 6 inches thick and sunk deep in the ground, had been ripped clean out. Not just pushed over, mind you, completely pulled out of the ground and tossed aside like it was nothing more than a twig. The wire that had connected it to the rest of the fence was twisted and mangled. I'm not a small man, and I know what it takes to set a post like that. It would take a tractor, or at least 3 strong men, to pull something like that out once it's properly set. But there it was, lying on the ground, dirt still clinging to the bottom where it had been yanked from the earth. The hole it left behind was ragged, with chunks of dirt scattered around it. I checked for tracks, but the ground was hard there, not like the boggy area where I'd been working earlier. Still, there were some indentations in the softer patches nearby. Large impressions, bigger than my work boots by a good margin, and with a shape I couldn't quite make out clearly. By this point, I was more angry than scared. Whatever this thing was, it was destroying my property and threatening my livelihood. I spent the next hour inspecting the rest of the fence line, but found no other damage. I went back to work on the boggy section fence, rifle propped against a nearby tree. Every few minutes I'd stop and scan the tree line, listening for anything unusual. The whole time, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. You know that feeling when you're being watched? It was like that, only worse. I finished up around 4:30 and headed back to the house. I didn't say anything more to my wife about it. She was already worried enough. That night, I barely slept. Kept listening for sounds outside, getting up to check the window. Nothing came. The next morning, I went back to check both areas in the daylight. The cattle were calmer, grazing normally. The fence post was still there on the ground where I'd found it. I looked harder for tracks this time and found a few more indistinct impressions in the soft earth near the boggy section. They were large, elongated, with what looked like 5 toes. Not a bear print, not a human print. Something else entirely. I wasn't sure what to do. I'm not one to go spreading wild stories, and I knew if I started talking about some giant hairy creature on my property, people would think I was drinking or going senile. So I kept it to myself for a few days, but word gets around in small communities, even when you don't say anything. My cattle had been spooked badly enough that a neighbor asked if I'd had trouble with coyotes. I mumbled something non-committal, but I think he sensed there was more to it. About a week later, a man named John Green came by the farm. Said he'd heard I might have seen something unusual. Turns out he was some kind of researcher who collected reports of Sasquatch sightings. I'd heard the name Sasquatch before, of course. Those stories had been around forever. But I'd never given them much thought. Just tall tales, I figured. But after what I'd seen, I wasn't so sure anymore. I took Green out to the spots where it all happened. He brought another researcher with him, Renee something or other. They examined everything, the fence post, the ground where I'd seen the creature, the indistinct tracks. They took measurements, photographs, asked me detailed questions. Green seemed particularly interested in the fence post. He tried to lift it himself and couldn't. He said that based on how it had been installed and how securely it had been attached to the wire, nothing human could have pulled it out like that without tools, not even several men working together. The tracks were too degraded by then to make casts, but they took photos and measurements anyway. Green said they matched other prints they'd documented elsewhere, something he called consistent with Sasquatch sign. I don't know what to make of all this, even now. I know what I saw that day. It wasn't a man, it wasn't a bear, it wasn't any animal I've ever encountered in all my years on that land. Whatever it was had incredible strength and moved in a way that still gives me chills when I think about it. I never saw it again after that day. Never found any more damage to my property either. It's like it just passed through, left its mark, and vanished. But every time I work near that tree line or hear my cattle getting restless, my mind goes right back to that moment when I stood there watching this massive hairy creature running on 2 legs across my pasture. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. Hell, I wouldn't believe it myself if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, but I know what I saw. And I know that fence post didn't pull itself out of the ground. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, moving through the forests, avoiding people mostly, but occasionally running into someone like me who's just going about their day, never expecting to have their whole understanding of the world turned upside down in the span of a few moments. All I know is that July 9th, 1966 changed something in me. I still work the land. I still tend my cattle. But I never go out without looking over my shoulder now and then. And I never dismiss those strange stories people tell anymore. Sometimes the unbelievable is exactly what's standing right in front of you, whether you're ready to see it or not. Story 8. I've been a cattle farmer in Richmond my whole life, and I've seen just about everything you'd expect out here. Coyotes, the occasional mountain lion, even a few bears over the years. But what happened that day in July of '66 wasn't normal, not even close. I've kept this bottled up for too long, and my brother Bob finally convinced me to share what we saw. It was July 14th, 1966. I remember the date because it was exactly 2 weeks after Independence Day, and we were still finding spent firecrackers in the yard from the neighborhood kids. The summer heat was brutal that year. My hired hand, Hank Prost, and I had been putting off repairing some damaged shingles on my roof for weeks, but with rain in the forecast, we couldn't delay any longer. We'd started early that morning around 7:30, trying to beat the worst of the heat. By mid-morning, we were making good progress. From up on that roof, you could see the entire property, the barn, the equipment shed, and the west pasture, where I'd moved about 100 head of cattle the day before. These weren't my regular milk cows. They were range cattle I'd brought in for finishing, still wild and skittish, not used to being penned up. I remember wiping sweat from my forehead and glancing out at the pasture. That's when I noticed something wasn't right with the herd. They were bunched up tight in the northeast corner, moving anxiously. "Hank," I said, "look at those cattle. Something's got them spooked." Hank stopped hammering and shaded his eyes. "Maybe a coyote?" That's when we saw it. At first I thought it was a bear. There was this large, dark shape moving along the tree line on the far side of the pasture, but something about how it moved didn't sit right. "You see that?" I asked Hank, pointing. "Yeah," he whispered, like whatever it was might hear us from a quarter-mile away. "What the hell is that?" The thing was massive, much bigger than any black bear I'd ever seen around here. It was covered in what looked like dark, matted fur or hair. But what really got me was how it moved. Sometimes it would drop down on all fours like you'd expect a bear to do, but then it would rise up and walk upright. And not in that awkward way bears do when they stand up momentarily. This thing was comfortable walking on two legs. It moved with purpose. What happened next still gives me chills. The creature started deliberately moving toward the cattle, not stalking like a predator about to attack, but almost like it was herding them. The cattle immediately panicked. All 100 head bolted, thundering across the pasture toward the barn. "Jesus Christ," Hank muttered. The cattle reached the fence line near the barn and stopped, milling around in obvious distress. Then the creature changed direction, circling around to approach from another angle. When it got within about 50 yards of the herd, they stampeded again, this time running to the opposite corner of the pasture. This was not normal cattle behavior, especially not for range cattle. They're used to predators. They'll usually bunch up, face the threat, maybe have the bulls position themselves between the cows and calves and whatever's threatening them. But this was different. They were in blind panic. I'd never seen anything like it. These were 1,000-pound animals running in absolute terror from this thing. Some were foaming at the mouth. A few crashed right into the fence, not even seeing it in their panic. One animal actually broke its leg trying to get away. I could see it go down hard and not get back up. "Don, what the hell are we looking at?" Hank asked, his voice shaking a bit. "I don't know," I answered honestly. Never seen anything like it. We stayed frozen on that roof, hammer and nails forgotten in our hands. I had a clear view of everything happening across that pasture, and I couldn't make sense of any of it. The creature kept at it, methodically circling the pasture, sending the cattle into a panic each time it approached. It wasn't hunting. It never tried to catch or attack any of the animals. It was almost like it was playing with them, or maybe studying their reactions. From our elevated position, I could make out more details. The thing was tall. I'd estimate 7 feet at least when standing upright. It had long arms that hung down past its knees. Its body was covered entirely in dark brown or blackish hair, shaggy and matted in places. The head sat directly on broad shoulders without much of a neck. I couldn't make out facial features at that distance, but the head seemed somewhat conical. The cattle stampeded a third time, then a fourth. Each time they ran back toward the barn and farm buildings like they were seeking safety, trampling the grass flat and raising dust clouds. Some were bleeding from charging the fence. They were exhausted and terrified. "Should we do something?" Hank asked. "Get the rifle?" I considered it. My Winchester was in the hall closet. I could be down there in 30 seconds, but something kept me rooted in place. Curiosity, maybe. Or fear. Either way, I just kept watching. After about 15 minutes of this bizarre harassment, the creature suddenly stopped. It stood completely upright, looking directly at the cattle, then slowly turned its head toward the farmhouse. I swear it looked right at us. A cold feeling washed over me, like ice water in my veins. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. Then it just turned and walked, on 2 legs the whole time, into the wooded area on the east side of the property. Not running, not hurrying, just calmly walking away like it had finished whatever it came to do. The cattle remained bunched up, trembling and snorting for nearly an hour afterward. Several were injured from crashing into fences or being trampled in the panic. The one with the broken leg had to be put down later that day. Hank and I barely spoke as we finished the roof. What could we say? We both knew we'd seen something impossible. When we finally climbed down around 2 p.m., we walked out to the pasture. The ground was torn up from all the stampeding, deep hoof prints everywhere, trampled grass, broken fence sections. I found some strange tracks along the tree line, huge impressions in the soft earth near the creek bed. They looked almost human, but much larger, maybe 16 inches long and incredibly wide. Some showed clear toe impressions. I tried to take photos, but they didn't come out clear enough. That night, I called my brother Bob. I hadn't even heard his story yet about what happened to him on the property a few weeks earlier. When I started telling him what Hank and I had seen, he got real quiet on the phone. Then he told me about his own encounter, seeing a similar creature while driving his tractor near the same wooded area. Same description, tall, hairy, walking upright. The details matched up too perfectly. "You think we should report this?" I asked him. "To who?" Bob replied. "Who'd believe us?" Eventually, we did tell a few people. The local sheriff came out, but just suggested it might be a bear, even after seeing those tracks. A couple of weeks later, some researchers who study Sasquatch reports visited. They took the whole thing more seriously, made casts of the tracks I'd found, interviewed us separately to compare details. They said our stories matched up with other reports they'd collected. They were particularly interested in how the creature had interacted with the cattle. Apparently, that behavior of deliberately harassing livestock had been reported in other cases too. And they thought the fact that both Hank and I had seen it together in broad daylight, from an elevated position with clear sight lines, made our sighting especially credible. The most unsettling part was learning that my brother had seen it just a few weeks before in almost the exact same location. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't just passing through, it was staying in the area, it was coming back repeatedly. In the weeks that followed, we noticed other strange things around the property. Unusual sounds at night, not quite like any animal I was familiar with. A sort of wood-knocking sound coming from the forest. Livestock acting nervous for no apparent reason. My dogs refused to go near the eastern tree line, even when called. I sold those range cattle earlier than planned. Couldn't bear to watch them suffer that level of fear again. Some were still jumpy weeks later, and a few never really settled down after what happened. I lost money on the sale, but it felt like the right thing to do. Hank stayed on working for me until he moved to Oregon in '68, but he never liked being out in that pasture alone after what we saw. Can't say I blamed him. I installed more floodlights around the property that fall, covering every approach to the house and barn. For about a month after the sighting, I kept a rifle by the door and spent many nights just watching out the window. I never saw the creature clearly again, though there were times I'd catch glimpses of something moving at the forest edge, or hear branches breaking in the woods when there shouldn't have been anything large enough out there to make that kind of noise. We had our story published in some newsletter about Sasquatch sightings, but most people locally just thought we were making it up or had seen a bear. But I know what bears look like. I've hunted them. This wasn't a bear. To this day, I don't know what Hank and I witnessed from that roof. I can tell you it was large, powerful, covered in hair, and moved with intelligence. It deliberately terrorized those cattle like it was conducting some kind of experiment, and it was aware enough of its surroundings to notice us watching it from a quarter-mile away. I still own that same property, though I've scaled back operations in my old age. Sometimes I sit on the porch at dusk, looking out at that tree line, wondering if it's still out there, wondering what it wanted, wondering why it came back to the same place my brother had seen it. The cattle knew what it was. That level of fear wasn't normal. They sensed something about that creature that we humans couldn't quite grasp. Sometimes I think animals understand more about the world around us than we do. They knew to be afraid. Maybe we should have been more afraid too. I don't expect anyone to believe this story. Hell, some days I'm not sure I believe it myself. But Hank and I know what we saw that day. So did those 100 head of cattle. And somewhere out there that thing is still roaming these woods. At least that's what keeps me up at night. Story 9. I've debated whether to share this for decades. Most people I've told think I'm crazy or looking for attention. I'm 78 now and figure I don't have much to lose anymore. What happened to me on July 21st, 1966 has haunted me for my entire life, and I need to put it down somewhere. My name is John Osborne. I was an artist, still am, I suppose, though arthritis has made it harder these days. Back in '66, I was 23 and serious about my craft. I'd spend days outside sketching landscapes around Richmond, British Columbia, trying to capture the light and textures of the region. That area was less developed then, lots of farms, wetlands and wild spaces along the Fraser River Delta. That Thursday started like any other summer day. The weather was perfect, clear skies, about 70 degrees with a light breeze coming off the water. I packed my materials, sketch pad, charcoals, pencils, a thermos of coffee and some sandwiches, planning to spend the entire day working. I chose a spot on the dike at the foot of number 3 road, which gave me a perfect vista of farmland, transitioning to wetlands with mountains in the background. The composition was exactly what I wanted for a series I was working on. I arrived around 9 a.m. and set up my folding stool. The morning passed uneventfully as I roughed out the basic scene. A few farmers passed by on tractors nodding hello. By early afternoon I was deeply focused, working on details of some distant trees. It was about 2:30 p.m. when I felt something change. It's hard to explain, but artists develop a kind of awareness of their surroundings. You need to notice shifts in light, movement, the way shadows fall. This was different. It was like the ambient sounds of the environment suddenly dimmed, the birds stopped chirping, and I remember thinking how strange that was. I looked up from my sketch pad, scanning the landscape, thinking maybe a hawk or some predator was nearby. That's when I saw it. About 75 yards away, standing perfectly still in a patch of bushes near the edge of a raspberry field, was a figure. At first, I thought it was a man, maybe a farm worker taking a break, but within seconds I realized this was no man. It was tall, very tall. I later estimated between 6 feet 8 inches and 7 feet, using the height of the bushes as reference. The entire body was covered in smooth brown hair, not matted or unkempt like you'd expect from an animal, but smooth and uniform, almost like a short coat. The hair appeared to be about 3 to 4 inches long, with a slight reddish tint where the sun hit it. The face is what struck me most. It wasn't ape-like at all, which contradicted everything I'd heard about these creatures. It had a broad, flat nose and deep-set eyes under a pronounced brow ridge. The jaw was strong, but proportional to the face. I couldn't make out fine details at that distance, but the face had distinctly human features, just different, larger, more primitive, maybe. What made my blood run cold was its posture. It wasn't hunched over like a gorilla. It stood fully upright, with shoulders back, looking directly at me with what I can only describe as intelligence and purpose. Its arms hung at its sides, longer than a human's, but not disproportionately so. The hands were large, but I couldn't see details of the fingers. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10-15 seconds. I didn't feel threatened exactly, but there was an overwhelming sense of being evaluated by something that didn't belong in my understanding of the world. Then, without any rush, it simply turned and walked into the denser brush. No crashing, no dramatic exit, just deliberate movement, like someone deciding a conversation was over and walking away. The bushes swayed slightly, then nothing. I sat there frozen, my sketchpad forgotten on my lap. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I remember thinking, this can't be real, but I knew what I'd seen. My mind kept replaying those seconds, afraid I'd forget a detail. After maybe 5 minutes of stunned silence, I picked up my charcoal and began to sketch frantically. I had to capture it while the image was fresh. My hands were shaking, but the training took over. I did 3 quick sketches. A full figure, then a close-up of what I remembered of the face, then a scale drawing comparing it to the surrounding vegetation. I didn't tell anyone immediately. Who would believe me? I packed up my things and walked back to my car, constantly looking over my shoulder. The whole landscape seemed different now, potentially hiding something, watching me. I drove home in a daze, nearly missing my turn twice. That evening I refined my sketches, adding details while they were still fresh in my mind. I couldn't sleep that night. Every noise outside my window made me jump. I kept thinking about the intelligence I'd seen in those eyes. This wasn't some animal. There was something knowing in its gaze. The next morning I heard reports on the local radio about strange sightings in Richmond. A woman named Darlene, something had seen a creature looking over raspberry bushes while she was babysitting at a farm just a couple miles from where I'd been. Then a store owner reported seeing something cross a road near the dike early that morning. Their descriptions matched what I'd seen. I decided to come forward. I called the local paper and spoke with a reporter who connected me with researchers investigating the sightings. They interviewed me for hours, going over every detail. They seemed especially interested in my sketches, saying they were the most detailed visual evidence they'd encountered. The following weeks were a circus. Local news, then national outlets picked up the story. Some people believed me, many didn't. I was labeled everything from an attention seeker to delusional. A few wildlife experts suggested I'd seen a bear standing on its hind legs, but that's absurd. I know what a bear looks like. This was bipedal, with proportions and movements nothing like a bear. What bothered me most were the skeptics who attacked my credibility as an artist, suggesting I'd fabricated the sketches for publicity, as if I wanted the ridicule and harassment that followed. I turned down offers for paid interviews and refused to sensationalize what happened. I just wanted people to know the truth of what I'd seen. The scientific community largely dismissed the sightings, of course. Without a body or clear photographic evidence, my testimony, even with detailed sketches, was just an anecdote to them. But the local indigenous communities took my account seriously. An elder from the Musqueam Nation visited me privately, explaining that his people had traditions about such beings going back generations. They called them Sasquatch and considered them not animals, but a different kind of people who lived in the wild places. Over the following months, investigators found large, unusual footprints in the area. Hair samples were collected, but inconclusive. The activity eventually died down, and people moved on to other news. But I never forgot. I returned to that spot on the dike many times over the years, hoping for another glimpse, but never saw anything unusual again. Whatever passed through Richmond that summer of '66 seemed to move on. The experience changed me. I became more interested in wilderness areas, spending weeks at a time painting in remote locations throughout British Columbia and Washington State. I half hoped for another encounter, but also dreaded the possibility. I've had strange experiences, feelings of being watched, unusual sounds at night, but nothing I could definitively say was another Sasquatch. My original sketches are now with researchers at a university, but I kept copies. I still look at them sometimes, comparing them to other reported sightings and the various depictions that have emerged over the decades. Most get it wrong. Too ape-like, too monstrous. What I saw was something much more human-adjacent, something that made me question the neat categories we use to organize the natural world. Some nights I still wake up remembering those eyes. They weren't animal eyes. There was comprehension there, assessment. Sometimes I wonder what it saw when it looked at me. Was I as strange to it as it was to me? Was it as shocked to encounter a human with a sketch pad as I was to see it standing in the bushes? I've never been able to explain what I saw that day. After decades of reading about similar encounters and talking to other witnesses, I'm convinced these creatures exist, whatever they are. The Richmond sightings weren't isolated. There were dozens of reports throughout the Pacific Northwest during that period, many from credible sources who had nothing to gain from coming forward. The three of us who saw something in Richmond that day and night never met before sharing our stories, yet described the same thing. What are the odds of that being coincidence or mass delusion? I'm not asking anyone to believe me. I know what I saw, and the image is as clear in my mind today as it was 57 years ago. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a man in a suit, and it certainly wasn't my imagination. It was something else, something that shouldn't exist according to our textbooks, but was as real as anything I've ever seen. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, or others like it, moving silently through the remaining wild places, watching us encroach further into their territory. Do they remember us, the humans who glimpsed them? Do they have their own stories about the strange encounters with us? I'll never know. All I have is those few seconds of mutual recognition across 75 yards of open field, a moment when two worlds briefly acknowledged each other before silently agreeing to part ways. No dramatic confrontation, no communication, just a quiet, profound moment that has defined the rest of my life. If you've seen something similar, you're not crazy. Trust what your eyes tell you. The world is stranger than we're taught to believe. Story 10. I'm not a person who gets spooked easily. I mean, as a deputy sheriff, I've seen some messed up stuff. Drunk drivers wrapped around trees, terrible domestic violence calls, and the aftermath of some pretty gnarly accidents. But none of that prepared me for what I encountered back in 2003. I've sat on this for 20 years now, and I still get goosebumps thinking about it. It was around February 2003, and I was driving home after spending the evening at my girlfriend's place in Dover. Being in a small Missouri town, there wasn't much to do except watch movies and hang out. I remember checking my watch as I left her place. It was almost 3 a.m. My shift started at 9 the next morning, so I needed to get back to Lexington and catch some sleep. The drive from Dover to Lexington isn't long, maybe 20-25 minutes, but it takes you through some seriously empty country. Coal Mine Road cuts right through a section near the Missouri River bluffs. That road is notorious for being dark as hell, no streetlights, just woods and a couple properties spread far apart. The Kerr Orchard sits on one side and the Dunkel family farm on the other. Other than that, it's just trees, gravel and silence. I was driving my Ford Escort, nothing fancy, just a little 5-speed manual that got decent gas mileage. The radio was playing some late-night talk show, but I wasn't really listening. I was just tired and ready to get home. About halfway down Coal Mine Road, there's this nasty S-curve that forces you to slow down to about 25-mile pace, especially on gravel. I'd driven it hundreds of times over the 5 years I'd been seeing my girlfriend, so I was pretty much on autopilot. The night was unusually quiet. No raccoons, no deer, nothing darting across the road like usual. As I approached the first bend of the S-curve, my headlights swept across something in the middle of the road. At first, I thought it was a bear, which made no sense because we don't have bears in that part of Missouri. It was on all fours, and I remember thinking it looked massive, way bigger than a deer or coyote. My headlights fully caught it, and that's when I noticed the eyes. Yellow. Not the dull yellow reflection you get from a deer or raccoon, but a glowing, intelligent yellow that seemed to absorb my headlights and throw the light back at me. My stomach immediately knotted up. I slowed down, pumping the brakes carefully on the gravel. The thing, whatever it was, seemed startled by my approach. It scrambled toward the edge of the road, moving in this weird, lurching way that didn't look like any animal I'd ever seen. Then it happened. The thing stood up. I'm not talking about a bear standing on its hind legs. This thing unfurled itself from the ground and just kept going up and up. I'll never forget watching it rise to its full height, because it felt like it was never going to stop. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, no exaggeration. I'm 6'1", and this thing would have towered over me by a good 2 feet. And the mass of it, Jesus! It must have weighed at least 500 pounds, all of it looking like solid muscle. It wasn't fat or bulky in a soft way. It was built like those extreme bodybuilders, but bigger, much bigger. By this point, my car had slowed to maybe 10 mph, and I was about 30 feet away from it. The headlights fully illuminated it now. It was covered in this thick, matted hair, black and grey mixed together, hanging off its body in these long strands that must have been 8 to 10 inches in length. The hair on its chest and shoulders was thinner, and I could see lighter skin underneath, with these massive pectoral muscles clearly defined even under the hair. Its shoulders. I can't even describe how unnaturally broad they were. They seemed to stretch forever in each direction, and its arms hung down way past where arms should end below its knees. The proportions were all wrong for a human. All wrong for any animal I know. I couldn't see its face clearly. The hair was too thick around its head, hanging like a curtain. But I knew it was looking right at me. I could feel it. Those yellow eyes boring into me from behind that hair. It just stood there, completely still, as I approached. It wasn't threatening me or making any moves. It was like we were both frozen in shock, having stumbled across each other in the middle of nowhere. As I passed it, maybe 15 feet away at this point, I was so terrified that I screwed up shifting gears. My hand was shaking so bad that I nearly stalled the engine when I pushed in the clutch and downshifted. The car lurched, and I thought for a split second that it was going to die right there, with that thing standing just feet away from me. The engine caught, thank God, and I accelerated away. I didn't floor it. Some part of my brain was still functioning enough to know that spinning out on gravel would be the worst possible thing. But I got away from there as quickly as I safely could. I remember checking my rearview mirror obsessively for the next few miles, convinced that this thing was going to be running after my car. But the road behind me stayed empty. When I got back to my place in Lexington, I just sat in the car for a good 10 minutes trying to process what I'd seen. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I'm not ashamed to admit that I checked under my car and looked around the yard before I went inside. Then I double-checked all the locks. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just sat in my living room with all the lights on, a cup of coffee getting cold in my hands, replaying what I'd seen over and over. The next morning, I told my parents and my brother about it. They could tell I was seriously shaken up. I'm not the type to make up stories or exaggerate. As a law enforcement officer, I'm trained to observe and report accurately. But even I was struggling to believe what I'd seen. My brother suggested it was a bear, just like I'd initially thought. But I've seen black bears on trips to other states. This was not a bear. Bears don't have that body structure, those proportions, or move the way this thing did. My dad wondered if it was some guy in a costume. But who would be out at 3 a.m. on a deserted gravel road in the middle of nowhere wearing a costume? And no costume could fake those proportions or that mass. You can't fake weighing 500 pounds of muscle. You can't fake being 8 feet tall with arms that hang below your knees. I considered reporting it officially, but I didn't. What would I even say? That I saw Bigfoot? I'd never hear the end of it at the station. Small-town departments can be merciless with that kind of thing, and I didn't want to be that deputy for the rest of my career. I drove that same route hundreds of times after that night. Sometimes in daylight, sometimes at night. I never saw anything like it again. I'd scan the woods as I drove, especially around that S-curve, wondering if those yellow eyes were watching me from the tree line. I've thought a lot about what I saw over the years. I've looked at every possible explanation. A bear standing upright? No way. The proportions and movements were all wrong. Some kind of escaped zoo animal. The nearest zoo was hours away, and there was never any report of an escaped animal. The only thing that makes any sense is the thing that makes the least sense. I saw some kind of unknown primate that night, an unclassified species, something science hasn't documented or doesn't acknowledge. Call it Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever label works. I don't care about the name, I care about what I saw. And what I saw was an enormous, muscular, hair-covered, bipedal creature standing in the middle of Coal Mine Road at 3 a.m. on a February night in 2003. I still work in law enforcement. I've advanced in my career. I'm respected by my peers and the community. I've never had any issues with hallucinations or delusions, before or since. I don't drink or use drugs. I was completely sober that night, just tired. And yet I saw what I saw. The thing that gets me the most when I think back on it wasn't just how massive and powerful this creature looked. It was the intelligence I sensed behind those eyes. It wasn't the vacant stare of a deer caught in headlights. There was awareness there, recognition, maybe even curiosity. It knew what I was. It understood that we were two different species encountering each other in the dark. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I'd stopped the car. Would it have approached, run away, attacked? I'll never know, and I'm glad I didn't find out. The area around Coal Mine Road has changed a bit over the years. There's been some development, more traffic. I wonder if that thing is still out there, moving deeper into the less accessible parts of the bluffs, avoiding human contact. Or maybe it was just passing through, a nomad that's long gone from the area. I've heard other stories since then, other people in rural Missouri who've had similar encounters. Most keep quiet about it, just like I did for all these years. Nobody wants to be the crazy person who claims they saw Bigfoot, but I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a man in a costume, it wasn't a trick of light or shadow. It was something else, something that walks the boundary between the world we know and the world we don't. That S-curve on Coal Mine Road near the Missouri River Bluffs is still there. The Kerr Orchard and Dunkel Farm are still there. Everything looks the same. But I know something now that I didn't know before that night. I know that we don't know everything that's out there in the dark. I know that science hasn't classified every creature that walks this earth. And I know that sometimes at 3 a.m. on a lonely gravel road, the impossible can suddenly become very, very real. Arsil, Story 11. I've been holding this in for over 10 years now. What happened that day in April 2013 has haunted me, and I've only told a handful of people about it. Most just give me that look. You know the one, like I'm making it up or I saw a bear or something, but I know what I saw. Emma knows what we saw. And I'm finally ready to share it here because I need to get this off my chest. And maybe someone else has experienced something similar. It was Saturday, April 27th, 2013. I remember the date perfectly because it was the weekend before my biology final, and I was procrastinating studying by going frogging with my best friend Emma. We lived in Lafayette County, Missouri, where my parents owned a small farm with this marshy area about a quarter-mile behind our house. The spring had been really wet that year. We'd had rain for like 5 days straight before that weekend, so the ground was super soggy and the frogs were everywhere. Emma had spent the night, and after lunch, we decided to head out to the marsh to catch some frogs. Nothing special about this. We'd done it a million times before. It was just something to do in the country when you're bored. The day was warm, but not hot, maybe mid-60s, and the sun was starting to get lower in the sky. We'd been out there for a couple hours already, our jeans soaked to the knees from trudging through the reeds and mud. Our old cat Pepper had followed us out there, like he sometimes did, probably hoping we'd stir up some mice or something. He was perched on this half-rotted tree stump at the edge of the marshy area, cleaning himself and looking smug like cats do. It was getting close to dinner time, around 6:29 according to the timestamp on the last photo I took of a bullfrog we'd caught. Emma was crouched down by the water about 15 feet away from me, and I was standing up, stretching my back because it was getting stiff from bending over so much. That's when I saw it. I was facing east, toward a line of trees that bordered the marsh, before it sloped down toward the old county road. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Between two of the larger oak trees, maybe 10-15 yards away, something moved, something big. My brain didn't process what I was seeing at first. It was like when you see something so out of place that your mind just short-circuits for a second. This figure was massive, blackish, almost like wet fur, and it moved between the trees with this weird, fluid motion. I only saw it directly for maybe a split second before my body just froze. But in that moment, I registered that whatever it was stood at least 8 feet tall. That's not an exaggeration. Those oak trees were mature trees, and this thing's head was easily visible above the lower branches. The width of it is what really got me. It wasn't just tall, it was wide. Like if you put 2 or even 3 normal men side by side, that's how broad its shoulders and back were. And its head, God, its head didn't sit on the shoulders like a person's does. It was almost like it was hunched forward, but not in a bent-over way. The head just seemed to sit forward on the shoulders naturally, and I noticed this especially when it turned sideways to leave. I must have made some kind of noise because Emma looked up at me, then followed my gaze. By then, the thing had already moved, but she saw it moving away, heading east a few steps, and then turning south behind the tree line. Simultaneously, Pepper, who had been calmly grooming himself, suddenly went into full-on panic mode. His back arched up, his fur stood on end, and he started making this horrible screeching, hissing sound I'd never heard him make before. It wasn't like when he fought with other cats. This was pure primal fear. "What the fuck is that?" Emma whispered, her voice shaking. I couldn't even answer. My mouth was dry and my heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. We both stood completely still, afraid to move. A few moments later, we heard barking. The neighbors' dogs, they have these 3 big German shepherds, had apparently come over to our property and were heading toward the marsh. This wasn't unusual. They often roamed around the connected properties. But what happened next was definitely not normal. The dogs got to about where we had seen the creature cross, and suddenly their barking changed from excited to terrified. Then they just turned and bolted, tails between their legs, running back toward their house like something was chasing them. That's when we heard it, a low, rumbling growl that rose into something that sounded like barking, but not like a dog barks. It was like something was imitating the sound of the dogs, but getting it just wrong enough that it sent chills down my spine. The sound came from the direction where the creature had disappeared. And then, this is the part that still makes my skin crawl, we heard a similar sound coming from the opposite direction, from across the small lake in the marsh, then another from somewhere to the north of us. "There's more than one," Emma whispered, grabbing my arm so tight it hurt. I nodded, unable to speak. We were surrounded. The sounds changed then. From the east, where the first creature had gone, came this weird, low moaning that sounded like a cow. But we didn't have cows in that field, and our nearest neighbor with cattle was over a mile away. It was like whatever these things were, they were making noises to distract us or confuse us. I remember thinking with absolute clarity, they're communicating with each other, they're intelligent, and they're coordinating something. We stood there, frozen in place for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few minutes. The strange calls continued, moving positions slightly, coming from different directions. Sometimes the barking imitation, sometimes the cow-like sounds, and occasionally this weird, wood-knocking noise that I'd later learn is commonly associated with these creatures. Pepper had retreated to hide under a fallen log, still hissing and clearly terrified. Emma and I had backed up until we were standing back to back, trying to watch all directions at once. "We need to go," I finally managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. "What if they're waiting for us to move?" Emma whispered back. That thought hadn't even occurred to me, and it made my blood run cold. Were they hunting us, herding us, just watching us? I had no idea, but staying put seemed like the worst option. "Let's just walk. Don't run, back toward the house," I said. "Stay close." We started moving slowly, trying not to splash in the shallow water or make any sudden movements. The sounds continued, but seemed to be moving away from us, circling around to the east side of the property, away from our path, back to the house. As we reached the edge of the marsh and started up the slight incline toward our yard, the sounds began to fade. Whatever these things were, they seemed to be retreating deeper into the woods that bordered the county road. When we were about halfway back to the house, I got this crazy idea. I don't know why I did it. Maybe to confirm what we'd heard wasn't just in our heads, but I stopped, picked up a sturdy stick and knocked it against a tree trunk. 3 distinct knocks. We waited, holding our breath. From far off, barely audible, came 3 faint knocks in response. Emma and I looked at each other, her face as pale as I'm sure mine was. We didn't say another word, just turned and walked as fast as we could back to the house without breaking into an all-out run. Just as we reached the back porch, my mom came bursting out the door, looking worried. "What was all that racket?" she asked. "I heard the neighbors' dogs going crazy and then all sorts of weird noises. Everything okay?" I looked at Emma, and she looked at me. In that moment, we made a silent agreement. My family knew these woods had strange things happen occasionally. We weren't the only ones in the county with stories. "Mum," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "we just saw one of them. By the marsh. It was huge." To her credit, my mum didn't dismiss us or tell us we were imagining things. She just nodded, looked out toward the tree line, which was now casting long shadows as the sun began to set, and said, "Come inside. Tell me exactly what you saw." We sat at the kitchen table, still muddy and wet from the marsh, and told her everything. The massive black figure, its strange proportions, the way Pepper reacted, the dogs running away, the imitation sounds, and the knocking. Sounds like you had more than one around you, she said matter-of-factly. They do that sometimes, try to confuse you or distract you. You believe us? Emma asked, surprised at how calmly my mom was taking this. Honey, that's not the first time something like that's been seen on this property, my mom replied. Ask your dad about what happened when he was clearing the North Field back in '98. And that was it. Just another day on the farm in Lafayette County. Except it wasn't, not for me and Emma. Something fundamental had changed in how we saw the woods around us. They weren't just empty spaces anymore. They were inhabited by something intelligent, something massive, something that could imitate other animals and communicate with others of its kind. We never went frogging alone after that. We never stayed in the marsh past late afternoon, and we always told someone where we were going and when we'd be back. I've spent countless hours since then researching what we saw. Most people call them Bigfoot or Sasquatch. Some local old-timers just call them the woods people or the tall ones. Whatever name you give them, I know they're real. I saw one with my own eyes. I heard them communicating with each other. And the way they moved, so deliberate, so aware, tells me they're far more intelligent than most people give them credit for. To this day, I can't explain why they didn't approach us or what their intention was. Were they curious, protective of their territory, just passing through? I don't know. But I do know that they're out there, in the woods of Lafayette County, and probably lots of other places too. I still live in Missouri, though not on that farm anymore. Emma moved to Chicago after college and laughs off the experience when it comes up, saying we probably saw a bear. But sometimes when we're alone, she'll admit she still has nightmares about that day. As for me, I still go hiking and camping, but I never go alone. And I always leave before dusk. Because the one thing I learned that day in April 2013 is that we don't know nearly as much about the world around us as we think we do. There are things in the woods that science hasn't catalogued, that most people will never see. And maybe that's for the best. Sometimes at night I still hear those knocks in my dreams. 3 distinct sounds, and in the dream I always find myself reaching for a stick to knock back. Story 12. I was 12 years old, living with my dad in central Florida. Not the Florida most people think of with beaches and theme parks, but the rural part. All pine forests, abandoned orange groves, and cypress swamps. Our house sat on a small hill, nothing fancy, just a single-story place surrounded by wilderness. My mum had left a few years earlier, so it was just me and Dad. It happened in late November. The air had that slight chill that passes for winter down here. Dad and I had this routine where we'd hunt rabbits after dark, nothing cruel about it. We ate what we caught, and it was a way for us to bond. Plus, it helped keep the rabbits from destroying what little garden we had managed to grow in that sandy soil. Our technique was simple, but effective. We'd turn on the corner floodlights mounted on our house, which would illuminate the edge of our yard. The rabbits would come out to feed on the grass where it met the tree line, and the lights would reflect in their eyes, making them easy to spot. Dad called it shining for rabbits. That night started like any other. After dinner, Dad grabbed his old Stevens 12-gauge shotgun, the one his father had given him, and I got the big Maglite flashlight that was almost too heavy for my skinny arms. Dad wore this headlamp that made him look like a coal miner. He always joked that he looked ridiculous, but it kept his hands free for the shotgun. "Ready, Jason?" he asked, checking the shells in his pocket. I nodded, feeling that familiar mix of excitement and nervousness I always got before we went hunting. The nervousness wasn't about the hunting. It was just the darkness. Even with the lights, the woods around our property always seemed to be hiding something. We stepped out the back door, and the floodlights were already casting long shadows across the yard. The air was cool and damp against my face. Dad immediately started moving east along the tree line, scanning for the telltale reflection of rabbit eyes in the grass. "I'll check the west side," I said, my voice sounding small in the night air. Dad nodded, already focused on his task. I turned and headed toward this old wooden bench that sat at the northwest corner of our yard. It was my favorite spot to sit and watch for rabbits, because they often came out there, where an old fallen log created a natural pathway from the woods to our yard. The floodlights didn't reach quite as far in that corner, creating deeper shadows under the pine trees. I walked slowly, sweeping my flashlight beam back and forth along the edge of the woods, looking for that distinctive green eyeshine. I was about 20 feet from the bench when I saw it. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. There was someone, crouched by the bench, just 6 or 8 feet from the tree line. It was hunched over, massive shoulders bunched up, completely still. I stopped dead in my tracks. The beam of my flashlight trembled as my hand started shaking. Whatever it was big. Way too big to be a person. Way too big to be anything that should be in these woods. The second my light hit it, the thing moved. Not just moved, it exploded upward, unfolding from its crouch into a fully standing position in one fluid motion while simultaneously turning away from me. It all happened so fast that I didn't even have time to yell or run. It was standing on 2 legs, human legs, but not human. Nothing human could be built like that. Even though it had turned away quickly, I got a clear view of its back. It stood a little shorter than my dad, who's about 5'10", but it was so much wider. The shoulders were massive, like a linebacker, but bigger, more powerful looking. Its legs were thick, trunk-like, and there was barely any narrowing at the waist. The proportions were all wrong for a human. And the fur. Oh God, the fur. It covered its entire body, not as shaggy as a bear's coat, but definitely longer than a deer's. It was a brownish color from what I could tell in the partial light, and it seemed to shimmer slightly as the creature moved. The fur obscured most details of its muscles, but I could tell by the way it moved that it was incredibly strong. But the thing that's burned into my memory, the detail that still makes me wake up in a cold sweat sometimes, was its head. As it turned away, I noticed the head was tilted at a weird angle, down and to the left. It looked unnatural, like something had injured its neck, and the muscles had healed wrong, pulling the head into that awkward position. It took several strides away from me, long, purposeful steps that ate up ground faster than any human could move. Within seconds, it disappeared into the underbrush. I could hear twigs snapping and leaves crunching as it moved through the forest, the sounds fading quickly. I stood there, completely frozen. My mouth was open, but no sound came out. My brain was screaming at me to run, to call for my dad, but I physically couldn't speak. It was like my vocal cords had seized up from shock. I don't know how long I stood there, probably just a minute or two, but it felt like hours. Finally, I heard my dad's voice from somewhere behind me. "Jason, you see anything over there?" I couldn't answer him. I literally could not make my voice work. I just stood there, flashlight still pointed at the spot where the thing had disappeared. My dad must have sensed something was wrong because I heard his footsteps hurrying toward me. "Jason, what's wrong?" He put his hand on my shoulder and I nearly jumped out of my skin. I tried to speak, but all that came out was a weird choking sound. Dad knelt down in front of me, his face full of concern in the glow of his headlamp. "Son, what happened? Are you hurt?" I shook my head and finally managed to croak out, "There was something by the bench." Dad immediately went into protective mode, raising his shotgun and scanning the area. "What kind of something? A coyote?" "No," I whispered. "Bigger. Much bigger. Standing on 2 legs." Dad's expression changed. I'll never forget the look on his face. A mixture of disbelief and something else that looked a lot like recognition. "Stay here," he said firmly. And before I could stop him, he was walking cautiously toward the bench, shotgun at the ready. Just then, we heard it. From about a mile away, where our neighbor Mr. Wilkins kept his hunting dogs, there was a sudden explosion of barking and howling. Not the normal excited barking of dogs on a scent, but frantic, almost panicked barking, mixed with high-pitched howls that made the hair on my arms stand up. Those dogs sounded terrified. Dad froze, listening. The dogs continued their frenzied barking, and it seemed to be moving, following something through the woods. After what felt like forever, Dad returned to me. He was moving differently, more cautiously, constantly scanning the tree line. "Tell me exactly what you saw," he said quietly. I described it as best I could. The size, the fur, the strange, tilted head. With each detail, Dad's face grew paler in the harsh light of the floodlights. Did you see its face?" he asked hesitantly. I shook my head. It turned away too fast. Dad seemed almost relieved at that. He put his arm around my shoulders. "Let's go back inside. It's getting late." "But what about the rabbits?" I asked. "Not tonight, Jason." Once we were inside, Dad locked the door, something he rarely did out there. He closed all the blinds but kept peeking out every few minutes. I noticed he kept the shotgun leaned against the wall by his chair, within easy reach. "Dad, what was it?" I finally asked. He was quiet for so long, I thought he wasn't going to answer. "Probably just a bear," he said eventually, but I could tell he didn't believe it. "Bears don't stand on two legs like that," I said, "and it wasn't a bear's head. It was different." Dad sighed deeply. "There are things in these woods that most people don't know about, Jason. Things that have been here a lot longer than us." A chill ran down my spine. "Like what?" Instead of answering, Dad picked up the phone. He dialed a number and waited. "Sheriff, this is Robert Miller, out on County Road 44. There was a pause. "Yeah, we've had some kind of disturbance on our property tonight." As Dad spoke to the sheriff, he kept his voice low, deliberately vague. He mentioned something large moving through the woods, possibly heading toward the Wilkins place, given the way the dogs were carrying on. He never mentioned what I'd actually seen, the two legs, the fur, the tilted head. After a few minutes, Dad's expression changed to frustration. "No, I don't think it's teenagers, Jim." Another pause. "Fine, never mind. Sorry to bother you." He hung up, looking annoyed. "They're not coming?" I asked. "Sheriff thinks it's just kids messing around in the woods." Dad ran a hand through his hair. "Maybe it's better that way." We barely slept that night. Dad insisted I sleep in his room, on a mattress on the floor. I heard him get up several times to check the windows and doors. The dogs at the Wilkins place continued barking on and off throughout the night, which wasn't normal. In the morning, Dad went outside to check around the bench where I'd seen the creature. I watched from the window as he knelt down, examining something on the ground. When he came back inside, his face was tight. "What did you find?" I asked. "Nothing," he said too quickly. "Just some disturbed leaves." But I knew there was more. Later that day, when Dad was in the shower, I snuck out to look for myself. The ground was soft from recent rain, and there in the dirt near the bench was a footprint. Not a human footprint, not a bear print, but something in between. It was huge, easily twice the size of my dad's boot, with 5 distinct toe indentations. I'd never seen anything like it. For weeks afterward, Dad wouldn't let me go outside alone after dark. Our rabbit hunting stopped completely. Sometimes at night, I'd hear him on the porch, shotgun across his lap, just watching the tree line. About 3 months later, I was reading the local newspaper when I saw a small article tucked away on page 5. "Strange creature sighted in Baker County," the headline read. Baker County was about 40 miles from us. The article described how multiple residents had reported seeing a large, hair-covered bipedal creature moving through wooded areas at night. Some called it a skunk ape, Florida's version of Bigfoot. The article treated it like a joke, suggesting hunters had too much moonshine or teenagers were playing pranks. I showed it to Dad. He read it without comment, then folded the paper and set it aside. But that night, I heard him on the phone, speaking quietly to someone about the article. Over the next year, similar reports popped up in neighboring counties. Dad collected the articles, keeping them in a folder he thought I didn't know about. He never admitted what we'd seen that night, always changing the subject when I brought it up. But I know what I saw. I'll never forget that massive silhouette unfolding from its crouch, the abnormal tilt of its head, the impossible speed with which it disappeared into the trees. Sometimes I still dream about it, about what might have happened if I'd arrived at that bench just a minute earlier, or if it had turned toward me instead of away. I'm an adult now, living in another state, but I still won't go camping. I still can't shake the feeling that there are things in the wilderness we aren't supposed to see, things that have been watching us from the shadows since long before we arrived. And whenever I visit my dad back in Florida, I notice he still keeps that shotgun close at hand after dark, and he still won't go near the northwest corner of the property once the sun sets. Story 13. I've been debating for months whether to post this. My hands are actually shaking as I type. I've never told the full story to anyone outside my family and the researchers who came to investigate. Even now, I worry people will think I'm making this up or that I'm crazy. I'm not. What happened on our property in Montgomery County was real, and it still haunts me every single day. My husband James and I bought our dream property back in early 2008. 16 acres of beautiful Arkansas countryside that we'd worked our whole lives to afford. We were in our late 40s and had always planned to build our retirement home there. We set up a travel trailer as temporary housing while we saved for construction. The land was perfect. The north side had this gorgeous, densely wooded hillside that sloped down to a crystal-clear spring-fed creek. The southern part was overgrown farmland with wild blackberry and raspberry vines everywhere. It was like something from a magazine about country living. Neither of us are hunters. We've always just enjoyed watching wildlife, so we set up these feeding stations all over the property. We'd put out corn for the deer, special food for raccoons and bird feeders. I remember feeling so peaceful watching the animals from our trailer window those first few months. That feeling seems like a lifetime ago now. The first sign that something was wrong came in early June. James went out to refill the corn at our main deer feeding station near the edge of the woods. He came running back to the trailer, white as a sheet. I thought he'd been bitten by a snake or something. What he'd found was much worse. There was a deer carcass by the feeding station, but this wasn't like anything a normal predator would do. The front leg and the entire head had been completely torn off. Both back legs were snapped backward, not chewed through, but broken like someone had deliberately bent them the wrong way. The worst part was the inside of the deer. All the organs had been removed, and the cavity was filled with corn mush, like someone had stuffed our deer feed inside the body. It wasn't eaten normally. It was displayed. James called the game warden, who said it was probably just coyotes, but he didn't sound convinced. We were shaken up, but figured it was a one-time thing. Then 3 days later, the exact same thing happened at our second feeding station on the other side of the property. Same mutilation pattern. Missing head and front leg, broken back legs, organs removed, corn stuffed inside. At that point, we stopped putting out corn. We thought maybe a cougar had moved into the area, though the way the deer were mutilated didn't match what we'd read about mountain lion kills. But what else could it be? About a week after the second deer incident, I woke up around 5:30 a.m. to get some water. I noticed our porch light was on, which was weird because I was sure James had turned it off before we went to bed. When I looked out the window, I saw movement on the porch. There was a dog lying there, badly injured. I woke James up, and we went out to help it. The poor thing was terrified, whimpering and trying to drag itself away from us. Its back was covered in deep gashes, and one of its legs was barely attached. James managed to calm it down enough for us to wrap it in a blanket and drive it to the vet in town. The vet said the injuries weren't consistent with a car hit or a fight with another dog. Whatever had attacked it had incredible strength. Later that day, our neighbor Ed called to ask if we'd seen his Rottweiler. Ed's place was about a half-mile down the road. When James described the injured dog, Ed went quiet. It wasn't his Rottweiler. 2 days later, Ed found his dog, or what was left of it. His 200-pound Rottweiler had been killed, with one of its back legs completely torn off. Ed was convinced it was a bear, but we don't have many bears in that part of Arkansas, and the ones we do have don't typically attack large dogs unprovoked. That's when the noises started. Every morning when we'd step outside before dawn to have coffee on the porch, we'd hear these massive crashes in the woods, like something huge was moving through the trees. It wasn't the normal sound of deer or even wild hogs. It was deliberate and heavy, branches breaking, trees shaking. Then came the vocalizations at night. The first time we heard them, we were sitting in the trailer watching TV around 9 p.m. It started as this low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from just beyond our yard light's reach. Then it changed into a high-pitched whooping sound that made the hair on my arm stand up. I've heard coyotes, owls, foxes, and every other animal in these woods, but this wasn't anything natural. The whoops would go on for maybe 30 seconds, then stop. The worst part was when they were answered by similar calls from across the creek, like there was more than one of whatever was making these sounds. Sometimes they seemed to be communicating with different patterns of whoops and growls. One night, we heard what sounded like 5 or 6 different voices all calling back and forth. James recorded some of them on his old flip phone, but the quality was terrible. Still, when we played it for my brother who came to visit, he immediately asked if we had bears on the property. When we said no, he just shook his head and said we should consider selling the place. Coming from my tough-as-nails brother who'd spent 20 years in the military, that scared me more than the sounds themselves. Things escalated about 3 weeks after the first deer carcass. My nephew came to visit and wanted to go fishing in our creek. He came running back to the trailer, saying he'd found a giant footprint. We thought he was exaggerating until we saw it ourselves. Near the muddy bank of the creek was a footprint about 18 inches long. It was clearly a foot, 5 toes, a heel, an arch, but impossibly large and deeply pressed into the hard mud, like whatever made it was extremely heavy. We took photos with James's phone, placing his size 11 boot next to it for comparison. His entire boot fit inside just the heel portion of the print. We found 3 more similar prints leading away from the creek toward the dense woods on the north side of our property. That same week, we discovered something had gotten into our vegetable garden. The fence was pushed down, and there were more of those huge footprints in the soft soil. Several tomato plants had been completely uprooted, and all the ripe tomatoes were gone. The weird thing was, nothing else was disturbed, just the tomato plants. Then the bird feeders started getting destroyed. We had these heavy-duty metal feeders that were wired shut to keep raccoons out. Something was tearing them down, bending the metal and emptying them completely. Our hummingbird feeder, which was suspended from a hook about 7 feet off the ground, would be emptied overnight. No spillage, just completely drained, and the plastic ports were often crushed. We were terrified but didn't know what to do. Who do you call when something impossible is happening? The police would think we were crazy. Game wardens had already dismissed our concerns about the deer. We felt completely alone. I was searching online for anything similar to what we were experiencing when I found a website about unexplained wildlife encounters. I sent them an email describing what was happening, not really expecting a response. To my surprise, a researcher named Tol Branco replied the next day. He asked detailed questions about the vocalizations, the footprints, and the animal deaths. When I sent him the poor quality photos of the footprints, he immediately called us. He and his colleague CK drove out to our property in mid-June. They were professional and didn't make us feel crazy, which was a relief. They spent the day examining the areas where we'd found the footprints and the feeding stations. They took plaster casts of the few remaining prints near the creek and collected hair samples from a broken branch, where CK noticed several long, dark hairs caught in the bark. That evening, while we were all sitting on the porch discussing what they'd found, we heard the whooping sounds again. James tried to imitate the sound for them, this weird, hollow whoop, whoop, whoop that echoed through the trees. Tall got this look on his face like someone had just confirmed his worst suspicions. He told us those were classic Sasquatch vocalizations, what some people call Bigfoot. I almost laughed. Bigfoot. That was ridiculous. But then he played recordings from other locations that sounded identical to what we'd been hearing. He explained that Sasquatch are known to mutilate deer in exactly the pattern we'd described, removing heads and limbs, breaking legs backward, and sometimes placing food inside the carcasses. They're also known to kill dogs that they perceive as threats to their territory. The researchers stayed overnight, setting up recording equipment around the property. Around 3 a.m., something triggered the motion-sensitive floodlights we'd installed after the dog incident. We all rushed to the windows. The lights illuminated the area between our trailer and the tree line, about 50 yards away. Standing at the edge of the woods was something. It was huge, easily 7 or 8 feet tall. Its silhouette was unmistakably not human, with massively broad shoulders and no neck that I could discern. It stood completely still, just staring toward our trailer. Then, without warning, the floodlights went out. We heard a crash from the utility pole where we'd mounted them, and when James went to check the next morning, the entire lighting unit had been ripped off the pole. Tall and CK left the next day with their evidence, promising to analyze everything and get back to us. They advised us to keep a log of all activity and to consider setting up game cameras. They also suggested stopping all feeding of wildlife, as they believed the corn was what initially attracted these creatures to our property. Over the next week, things got worse. One night, something circled our trailer for hours, occasionally slapping the metal sides hard enough to shake the whole structure. We heard heavy breathing outside our bedroom window and what sounded like crude vocalizations. Almost like someone trying to imitate human speech, but getting it wrong in a disturbing way. The final straw came when James went outside one morning to start our generator. We were still off-grid at that point. He found massive handprints in the mud near the generator, like human hands, but with fingers nearly twice as long as a normal person's. Next to the generator was a half-eaten rabbit, placed deliberately where James would find it, almost like an offering or a threat. We packed up that day and moved in with my sister in Little Rock. We couldn't explain what was happening and we couldn't live with the fear anymore. Tall called a few days later to tell us the hair samples were inconclusive, not matching any known wildlife but also not confirming his Sasquatch theory. The audio recordings, however, were sent to another researcher who confirmed they matched documented Sasquatch calls from Washington State. We ended up selling the property at a loss 3 months later. We never told the new owners what happened. Maybe that was wrong of us, but what could we say? By the way, there might be multiple Bigfoot creatures living in the woods. They would have thought we were insane. It's been 15 years now, and I still have nightmares about those whooping sounds and the massive silhouette staring at us from the edge of the woods. James refuses to go camping or hiking anymore. We bought a small house in a crowded suburb where the only wildlife is squirrels and the occasional raccoon. I still don't know what was on our property. I can't bring myself to definitively say it was Bigfoot or Sasquatch or whatever you want to call it. All I know is that something intelligent, powerful, and not human was stalking us. Something that could tear apart deer, kill large dogs, and understood enough about humans to target our food sources and utilities. Sometimes, I wonder if the new owners experienced the same things, or if the creatures moved on once we left. I've thought about reaching out to them to ask, but I'm afraid of the answer. I'm afraid those things are still out there, watching and waiting. Story 14. I still can't explain what I saw that December morning in 1950. It's been over 70 years, but the memory hasn't faded one bit. I was working as a supply runner for the logging camps, scattered across British Columbia's coastal islands. The job took me to some pretty remote places, but nothing prepared me for what I found on Roderick Island. It was unusually cold that week. The mainland had been hit by a freak cold snap, and even the coastal islands were feeling it. Usually, the ocean keeps temperatures mild, but that morning the thermometer on my boat read just 25 degrees. A light dusting of frost covered everything, unusual for that part of BC. I wasn't even supposed to be on Roderick that day. My regular route took me further north, but my boss had asked me to swing by the old abandoned abalone cannery to pick up some equipment barrels that had been left there from a previous operation. Just a quick stop, he said. Should take an hour, tops. I docked at the small wharf around 8 a.m. The place was eerily quiet. The cannery had been shut down for about 5 years by then, and nature was already reclaiming it. The main building was a large wooden structure with rusted metal roofing. Several smaller outbuildings dotted the shoreline. All of it was covered in that unusual frost I mentioned, making everything look like it was dusted with powdered sugar. I remember checking my watch as I stepped onto the wharf. The wooden planks creaked under my boots. I pulled my coat tighter. The cold bit through my layers like nothing I'd experienced on the coast before. My breath came out in thick clouds as I walked toward the main building. The barrels were supposed to be in the storage shed at the far end of the wharf. I passed by the main cannery building, noting how its windows were either broken or clouded with grime. Something about the place made my skin crawl. I'd been to plenty of abandoned sites before, but this one felt different, like it wasn't actually abandoned. I found the storage shed and went inside. It took about 15 minutes of searching before I located the barrels my boss wanted. They were heavy, filled with some kind of mechanical parts, but I managed to roll one out to the wharf. I was planning to make multiple trips rather than trying to move them all at once. After getting the first barrel to my boat, I turned to head back to the shed. That's when I noticed something odd. There were footprints in the frost where there hadn't been any before. Large footprints. They led from the main cannery building toward the tree line at the edge of the cleared area. At first, I thought another boat must have arrived while I was in the shed, but I could see the whole harbor from where I stood. Mine was the only vessel there. I followed the tracks with my eyes. They started right at the side door of the cannery, a door I was certain had been closed when I passed by earlier. Curiosity got the better of me. I walked over to examine the prints more closely. What I saw sends chills down my spine even now. These weren't human footprints. They were huge, easily 18 inches long and proportionally wide. They had 5 distinct toe impressions, and the stride length was incredible, maybe 4 feet between steps. I'd spent most of my life outdoors. I knew bear tracks, moose tracks, elk tracks. Hell, I could identify just about any animal native to British Columbia by its prints. These belonged to none of them. The frost had captured the impressions perfectly. Whatever made these tracks had come out of that building while I was in the storage shed, and it had headed straight for the dense forest that covered most of the island. I stood there for a long moment, my heart pounding in my chest. Part of me wanted to just get back in my boat and leave the rest of the barrels. But I've never been one to spook easily, and my curiosity was burning. I decided to check out the cannery building. The side door was ajar now, though I clearly remembered it being closed earlier. I pushed it open slowly. The hinges protested with a long, rusty groan. Inside, the building was cavernous and dark. Shafts of light broke through holes in the roof and the few unbroken windows, illuminating swirling dust particles. Old conveyor belts and processing equipment sat abandoned, like the skeletal remains of the operation that once thrived here. The air inside was stale but noticeably warmer than outside, and there was a smell, musky and wild, like wet fur and earth. It wasn't necessarily unpleasant, just primal somehow. My nose twitched at the unfamiliar scent. I moved cautiously through the building, my footsteps echoing on the concrete floor. In one corner, I found something that made my blood run cold. There was a sort of nest. That's the only word I can think of to describe it. Piles of old burlap sacks, tattered canvas, and what looked like dried vegetation had been arranged in a circular pattern. It was big enough for something large to lie in. And there was hair. Long, coarse, reddish-brown hair caught on the rough edges of the burlap and scattered around the nest. I reached down and picked up a strand. It was thick, thicker than human hair, but not quite like any animal fur I was familiar with. It was at least 8 inches long. Something had been living in this abandoned cannery, something big, and judging by the freshness of the tracks outside, I had just missed encountering it. I felt exposed suddenly, aware that whatever made that nest might decide to return. I backed away and hurried out of the building, not bothering to close the door behind me. When I got outside, I looked again at those tracks leading into the forest. Against my better judgment, I decided to follow them, just for a short distance. The ground beyond the cleared area was rocky and covered with moss and fallen needles from the towering pines and cedars. The frost was patchy here, and the tracks became harder to follow, but the thing that made them was heavy enough to leave deep impressions even where there was no frost. I followed them for maybe 100 yards into the forest. The trees grew dense quickly, blocking out much of the morning light. The silence was oppressive. No birds called, no squirrels chattered. It was as if everything was holding its breath. That's when I heard it, a sound I'll never forget as long as I live. It was a deep, throaty vocalization, not quite a growl, but more resonant than any human could produce. It echoed through the trees, making it hard to pinpoint the direction. Then came the sound of breaking branches, something large moving through the forest ahead of me. I froze, suddenly very aware that I was unarmed, except for a small pocket knife. I'm not ashamed to admit that fear gripped me then. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I knew that might be the worst thing to do. Instead, I slowly backed away, trying not to make sudden movements. As I retreated, I caught a glimpse of movement through the trees, maybe 50 yards ahead. Something tall and massive shifted between 2 large cedars. I couldn't make out details, just an impression of height and bulk that exceeded any black bear or other known wildlife in the region. Whatever it was, it stood upright. I continued my cautious retreat until I reached the edge of the forest, then turned and walked briskly, not quite running, back to the wharf. My hands were shaking as I untied my boat. The barrels could wait. I needed to get off that island. As I pulled away from the dock, I scanned the tree line one last time. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something standing at the edge of the forest, a dark, massive silhouette watching me. But it was gone so quickly, I couldn't be certain it wasn't just shadows playing tricks on my eyes. I made it back to the mainland in record time. For days, I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen. Who would believe me? I tried to convince myself I had encountered some unusual bear, perhaps standing on its hind legs, but those tracks, they weren't bear tracks. And that nest didn't match any bear behavior I'd ever heard of. About a week later, I mentioned the incident to an older colleague who had worked the coastal routes for decades. He didn't laugh as I'd expected. Instead, he suggested I speak with an elder from one of the local indigenous communities. The elder was a man named Joseph, probably in his 70s at the time. When I described what I'd seen, he nodded knowingly. According to him, his people had been aware of these creatures for generations. They called them the one who walks alone, and considered them neither animal nor human, but something in between, intelligent beings who preferred solitude and avoided contact with humans. Joseph told me that sightings were rare, but had occurred throughout his lifetime, mostly in the more remote islands and peninsulas. The creatures were known to take shelter in abandoned human structures during particularly harsh weather, exactly what seemed to have happened at the cannery. Over the years, I've heard other accounts from loggers, fishermen and locals that match aspects of what I experienced. The logging companies pushed deeper into the islands as the decades passed, and reports became more frequent for a time, then tapered off. Either the creatures moved to more isolated areas or people just stopped talking about them openly as ridicule from outsiders increased. I returned to Roderick Island the following week with 2 colleagues to retrieve those barrels. We found no sign of the nest. It had been cleared out. The tracks were long gone, melted away with the frost. My colleagues probably thought I was spinning tales, though they were kind enough not to say so directly. I've never had another encounter like that December morning, though I've spent plenty more time in BC's coastal wilderness. Sometimes when I'm in particularly remote areas, I get the sensation of being watched. The forest will go quiet, and that prickly feeling will crawl up my spine. I always head back to more open ground when that happens. I'm an old man now, and I've had a lot of time to think about what I saw that day. I've read the various theories and watched as Bigfoot and Sasquatch became cultural phenomena, often treated as jokes. It's frustrating because what I experienced wasn't funny or fantastical. It was real, and it was unsettling. I don't know what exists in the deep forests of British Columbia's coast. I can't claim to have seen a Sasquatch directly, and I have no evidence beyond my own recollection of those tracks in the frost and that strange nest. But I know what I experienced wasn't a bear, wasn't a moose, wasn't any recognized animal I'd encountered in my decades outdoors. The cannery on Roderick Island was torn down in the 1970s. The last time I passed by the island, about 15 years ago, nature had reclaimed the entire site. You'd never know humans had ever been there at all. Sometimes I wonder if that's for the best, if some places should be left to whatever ancient things still roam there, walking alone through forests we only think we understand. Those tracks in the frost taught me that the wilderness holds mysteries we haven't begun to unravel. And maybe some of those mysteries are watching us more closely than we realize. Story 15. I never told anyone about what happened that day in Smithers back in 1950. Some things just stay with you, gnawing at the back of your mind for decades, but you keep them locked away because who would believe you anyway? My name's Marcus Danielson, and I'm 91 years old now. I figure I should write this down before I take it to my grave. I was 19 that summer, working as a logger in British Columbia with a crew of about 15 men. Most were older, weathered types who'd been cutting trees since before I was born. But I was strong for my age, had to be in that line of work, and they respected that. My closest buddy on the crew was Thomas Goodell, though everyone called him Slim. Funny nickname for a man built like a brick outhouse, but that was logging camp humor for you. It was late June when it happened. The foreman had given us a day's break after we'd cleared a particularly difficult section. Most of the crew stayed at camp, playing cards or catching up on sleep, but Slim suggested we do some exploring. He'd heard from the local hunters about a game trail that was supposed to be crawling with deer. Could bag ourselves some fresh meat, he said, patting the rifle he always kept cleaned and ready. Better than the slop cookies been feeding us. I was restless anyway, so I grabbed my canteen and hunting knife, and we headed out just after sunrise. The forest around Smithers was dense back then, real old-growth timber that made you feel small, Douglas firs that stretched up forever, blocking out most of the sky, the kind of wilderness that seems to watch you. The game trail wasn't hard to find. It cut through the forest about half a mile from our camp, a narrow path worn into the earth by years of animal traffic. We walked slowly, keeping our eyes peeled for deer sign, talking in low voices about nothing important, just 2 young men enjoying a break from back-breaking work. Around mid-morning, Slim stopped so suddenly I almost bumped into him. "Mark," he said, pointing at the ground, You ever seen tracks like that before?" I looked where he was pointing and felt a chill despite the warm day. There, in the soft earth of the trail, was a footprint, but not from any animal I recognized, and certainly not from a man. It was shaped like a human foot, had 5 toes and everything, but was easily 16 inches long and 7 or 8 inches wide. The impression was deep too, like whatever made it was carrying serious weight. "Grizzly?" I suggested, though I knew better. Bear tracks don't look anything like this. Slim shook his head. "Ain't no bear." He knelt down and examined the print without touching it. "This here's a foot, like a man's foot only. Only 3 times the size," I finished for him. We both looked ahead down the trail and spotted more prints. They were spaced about 5 feet apart on the flat sections. Whatever made them had a stride twice as long as mine. "Let's follow 'em," Slim said, his voice hushed but excited. "Just for a bit." I should have said no. Every instinct told me to turn around, but curiosity is a powerful thing when you're young and think nothing bad can happen to you. So we followed those tracks, moving quietly now, both of us scanning the trees around us. After about 20 minutes, we noticed something else strange. The older trees along the trail, the ones with thinner trunks, maybe 4 inches in diameter, had their branches stripped clean up to about 20 feet high. Not all of them, just certain types. The maples and the younger firs especially. "Look at that," Slim whispered, pointing to one particularly mangled tree. "Something's been feeding here." I walked up to one of the trees and looked at it closely. The branches weren't broken off cleanly like you do with a saw or an axe. They were bent and twisted, the bark scraped away in places. I tried to bend the trunk myself, and I was no weakling back then, but couldn't even get it to budge an inch. "Whatever did this is strong as hell," I muttered. Slim was kneeling on the ground again. "Look here," he said, pointing to small piles of debris around the bases of the stripped trees. I squatted next to him and saw they were twigs and bits of bark that had been chewed on and then spit out. "Like someone was eating the tender parts and spitting out the rest," Slim said, his voice tight. We kept following the tracks. Neither of us mentioned turning back, though I know I was thinking it. The forest seemed to get quieter the further we went. No birds singing, no squirrels chattering, just the sound of our breathing and the occasional snap of a twig under our boots. The tracks led uphill for a while, and here we noticed they were spaced closer together, about 4 feet apart. Made sense. Even a giant would take shorter steps going uphill. The thought that we were applying human logic to these tracks made my skin crawl. About 2 miles from where we'd first spotted them, we came to a small clearing. The tracks crossed it and continued into the trees on the other side. But what made us stop was the state of the clearing itself. The grass was flattened in the center, like something large had been lying there. Around the edges, more trees had been stripped of their branches, and there were several piles of those chewed twigs. "It's feeding," I said quietly. "It's systematically working its way through the forest, eating the tender parts of these trees." Slim nodded, his face pale beneath his tan. "No animal I know does that. Bears don't. Deer don't. Nothing around here grows tall enough to reach 20 feet up either." That's when we heard it, a sound that haunts my dreams to this day. It wasn't exactly a growl or a roar. It was deeper, more resonant, almost like the rumble of distant thunder, but with a deliberate pattern to it. It came from somewhere ahead of us, beyond the clearing, and it made the hair on my arms stand straight up. We froze, staring into the trees where the sound had come from. Nothing moved, no branches swayed, no undergrowth rustled, but I had the overwhelming feeling that something was watching us, something intelligent. The light was starting to fade. We'd been following the tracks longer than I'd realized, and in the dense forest, dusk comes early. "We should head back," I whispered, not taking my eyes off the tree line. Slim nodded, but neither of us moved for a long moment. It was as if our bodies understood that turning our backs might be dangerous. Finally, Slim took a step backward, then another. I followed his lead. We backed away slowly until we reached the edge of the clearing, then turned and walked quickly back the way we'd come. Neither of us spoke until we were at least half a mile away. "What the hell was that?" Slim finally asked, his voice shaky. I shook my head. "I don't know." "Those tracks, they were like a man's but huge, and that sound." "I know." We walked faster as the forest grew darker. The tracks we'd followed so eagerly now seemed like a warning we'd ignored. Every shadow between the trees looked like it might hide something watching us. Every sound made us jump. About a mile from camp we heard it again, that deep rumbling sound. Closer this time, and right after, the crack of breaking wood, like a sizable branch being snapped in two. We didn't discuss it, we just ran. By the time we reached camp, we were gasping for breath. The other loggers were gathered around the fire eating dinner. They looked up as we stumbled into the light, faces curious. "You boys look like you've seen a ghost," the foreman said, chuckling. I glanced at Slim, and I could tell he was thinking the same thing I was. These men, these practical, no-nonsense loggers, wouldn't believe us. They'd laugh, call us crazy or liars or both. "Got turned around," Slim said, his breathing still heavy. "Almost didn't make it back before dark." The foreman snorted. "City boys," he said, though neither of us was from the city. "Sit down and eat before Cookie throws your portions to the raccoons." We sat and ate, but I couldn't taste the food. My mind was still out there in the forest, with those massive tracks and stripped trees, with that sound. Later in our tent, Slim and I talked in whispers. "We should tell someone," he said. "Who?" "The foreman. He already thinks we're idiots." "The local authorities, then?" I laughed bitterly. "And tell them what? That we found some big footprints and heard a weird noise?" Slim was quiet for a moment. "My grandfather used to tell stories," he finally said. "He worked with some native fellas back in the 20s. They told him about something they called, I don't remember the exact word, Sasquatch, I think, a giant, hairy, man-like creature that lived in the deepest parts of the forest." "Bigfoot," I said incredulously. "You think we saw Bigfoot?" "I don't know what we saw," Slim replied. "But those natives, they believed in it. Said it could bend young trees to get at the top growth. Said it left footprints just like the ones we found." I lay back on my bedroll, staring at the canvas above me. "Nobody would believe us," I said again. "Probably not," Slim agreed. The next morning, we were back at work, swinging axes and hauling logs like nothing had happened. But I kept looking over my shoulder at the forest, kept listening for that rumbling sound underneath the normal noises of the logging operation. 3 days later, one of the other loggers, an older guy named Peterson, came back from checking trap lines with a strange story. Said he'd found a game trail where all the small trees had been bent over and stripped of their top growth. Said he'd seen big man-like footprints in the mud. The other men laughed at him, called him a drunk and a liar. Slim and I said nothing, just exchanged glances across the fire. A week after that, the camp cook reported that something had broken into the food storage shed overnight, bent the metal lock right off the door, taken nothing but 20 pounds of dried fruit and a sack of sugar. The foreman blamed bears, though we all knew bears would have taken the bacon and smoked meat first. Again, Slim and I kept quiet. But that night, I woke up to that sound again, that deep, rumbling, almost voice, coming from just beyond the edge of camp. I lay perfectly still, listening as it continued for almost a minute before fading away. No one else seemed to hear it. Or if they did, they didn't let on. The next morning, we found more of those massive footprints circling the entire camp. That was my last season as a logger. I took a job in construction after that, building houses in Vancouver where the only thing in the woods was other people. Slim stayed on another year, then moved east. We kept in touch for a while, but eventually drifted apart like old friends do. I never went back to those woods near Smithers, never wanted to. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is still, I think I can hear that sound again. That deep, rumbling almost voice that's not quite animal and not quite human. And I wonder if whatever made those tracks is still out there, bending trees to feed, leaving its massive footprints for some other unlucky soul to find. Years later, I read in a newspaper that some native tribes in British Columbia have stories about the Sasquatch that go back centuries. They describe exactly what Slim and I saw that day, the feeding patterns, the footprints, even that distinctive sound. They say the creature is intelligent, curious about humans, but mostly wanting to be left alone. I hope that's true. I hope whatever we encountered that day just wanted to check us out, maybe warn us away from its territory. Because the alternative, that it was stalking us, hunting us, is too terrifying to consider, even after all these years. Whatever the truth is, I know what I saw, I know what I heard, and no amount of rational explanation has ever managed to convince me otherwise.